Hi and welcome to Karen's class. Today we'll be doing a full speed review of every single unit for AP Modern World History. And in this particular video, we'll be going over units 1 through 4. In a subsequent video, we'll be going over units 5 through 9. So let's get started without further ado. Just some caveats. So the plan is to update this full review every year or so, because this is my third iteration of teaching this particular course, and I want to leave a resource for students, but I also want to continue to realign this particular curriculum with the outlines as given by the College Board. And, College Board makes a lot of changes, infamously so, to its curriculum every couple of years or so, and I want to make sure that everything is up to date. So this is a review for 2023. Before we go any further, and if you're here just for the speed review, you can skip to the chapter where it starts with Unit 1, but I just want to mention that I want to give credit where credit is due, and there have been a lot of amazing, incredible teaching resources and materials by fellow teachers on the internet and elsewhere that have enabled me to teach my students in the best way that I was able to with the limited resources and the finite time that I had. And I have done my best to put everything together in a way that doesn't leave too much out without making students get too distracted. But what I want to do is really find that happy medium, that middle ground between allowing students to do the best they can in preparing for this test, which is administered by the College Board, and so that they can get a 5, but also so that that doesn't detract from their complete understanding of what transpired in the world at a given time. And so that medium between exhaustive comprehension, the totality of a holistic understanding of world history, and that pragmatic, very specific test-oriented preparation. I'm always striving for that. I probably haven't gotten anywhere near what I'm going for, but at the very least I hope this helps. And if you are a teacher, a fellow educator who sees some of your material reflected in my videos, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to give my students a full rundown over what they've been learning in their classes over the past year. And sometimes in this rush to get this out, I may have taken liberal inspiration from some of your resources. If you see something that you wish I could mention, give credit where credit is due, please leave a comment or send me some kind of message and we can work something out, right? But so that's out of the way. Let's continue. This is AP World History, the Modern Period. Now, as you know, the College Board made some changes a couple of years ago to how they describe or define what it means to be modern, right? And so according to the College Board, this spans 1200 CE to the present. This is not, by any stretch of the imagination, an academic definition of modern history, but I think what they're trying to do is they're really trying to zoom in on modernity, the problems of and the crises of modernity, and focus on the modern period. And in so doing, they're trying to sort of contextualize it and ensconce it in this general context of everything that happened from the post-classical period. Let's look at this course structure. If you pause the screen and zoom in the parts where there's a lot of text, that can be helpful in serving as your notes, for example. Just as a final sort of cramming guide in the days and hours leading up to the test. Okay, so let's look at the course structure, units, and themes. This test is divided into 4 chronological periods, as you know. There are 2 subunits for each chronological period. For the first chronological period, 1200 to 1450, we see the global tapestry and networks of exchange. For the second chronological period, 1450 to 1750, we see land-based empires and transoceanic interconnections. That's unit 3 and 4. And so that's what we'll be covering in the first part of our lesson. In the second part of our total review, we'll be going over 1750 to the present. And as you can see, the time period between 1900 to the present is subdivided into 3 different units. That explains the modern descriptor. The 6 themes. Theme 1 is humans and the environment, how humans interact with their environment as populations grow, as different farming techniques are developed, and as industrialization occurs and so on. Humans impacted their environment, they were impacted by the environment in turn, and this was a cycle that we see. Theme 2, cultural developments and interactions, right? And so as these populations developed into civilizations, there were cultures that developed, and then these different cultures interacted with each other, sometimes amalgamating, sometimes drifting apart, sometimes clashing, and so on. Theme 3, we have governance. Governance is essential for any state, and when we talk about state in this context, we're not talking about like Oklahoma or Idaho. We're talking specifically about any form of government that is administered in terms of someone that is doing the governing and people that are being governed, right? So that's what we're talking about when we're looking at governance and state formation. Fourth theme is economic systems, and so economic systems did not stay constant throughout the years. The most explosive conflict of the 20th and 21st centuries came about as a clash between differing ideas about economic systems, and so economic systems are very important in the development of human history. We'll be looking at that. Theme 5, social interactions and organization. Again, incredibly important because societies group their members and have different norms that guide their social interactions. We'll be looking at that specifically. Relationships between the different genders, right? Relationships between the different social hierarchies. We'll be looking definitely at those. Theme 6, technology and innovation. Hugely, incredibly important, especially because we are living in the so-called information age. As you can see, every aspect of our lives has been changed by these developments in technology over the past decade or more, really. And you can imagine how that translates to different time periods and throughout the world, throughout different regions of the world. Like a small, seemingly small innovation like the development of the saddle, for example, enabled people to ride camels more easily. That kind of thing completely changed how trade was structured along the Silk Road. The development of the lateen sail, as we're going to see, completely changed how the Indian Ocean trade was organized, and so on and so forth. And so we're going to definitely see how these themes are applied to different time periods and issues throughout human history. We'll go on to look at how the themes are spiraled throughout the course. Every time you see something repeated throughout your preparation for the test, you're going to see, for example, people like Ibn Battuta mentioned more than once. You're going to see people like Zheng He be mentioned more than once. And when you see someone being mentioned more than once, you're going to have to remember, okay, this is a point at which these different themes intersect throughout the units. And so when you see, for example, the tribute lists of the Mexica being repeated, you're going to think, okay, so this is something that's really important. This is something that I have to remember. This is where the spiral connects to the next level. And so you're definitely going to see repetition, but when something's repeated, it's because it's important. All right, so now let's go on to our main meat of this course. It is the speed review of all units. Units 1 through 4 specifically are what we'll be going for today. Let's start with the global tapestry. The first area that we are going to see is East Asia. So we're going to be looking at developments in East Asia from 1200 to 1450. First of all, we see that period 0, the classical period, spans the 6 dynasties to the 5 dynasties and the 10 kingdoms. You don't really need to know about the Sui and the Tang for this particular exam, but know that they existed, right? Just as a matter of course. And if anything about that intrigues you, feel free to jump into that rabbit hole, chasing that sense of wonder that is so integral to learning, and be passionate. Just allow yourself to chase that passion, follow that curiosity. If there are any images throughout this particular video that interest you, just feel free to give it a screenshot and ask Google Images what it's about, because the artificial intelligence is really out there getting all that information there for you. So feel free to do that. Governance, cultural developments and interactions, and economic systems. These are the key themes that the College Board CED, course exam description, wants you to know about this time period. The Song Dynasty specifically is where they really hone in, and the Song Dynasty utilized what? Traditional methods of Confucianism and an imperial bureaucracy to maintain and justify its rule. Bureaucracy and Confucianism, and how the empire used these tests of Confucianism to recruit bureaucrats. That kind of thing is what you really need to know. Chinese cultural traditions. They were on a continuum, right? They started even before the Six Dynasties, really. Those cultural traditions continued, right? And they influenced neighboring regions. You have Buddhism shaping societies in Asia at this time period. And the economic systems, you need to know the economy of Song China became very commercialized while continuing to depend on free peasant and artisanal labor. The economy of Song China was flourishing. There were a lot of trade networks that were expanding, and there were a lot of innovations being made in agriculture and manufacturing. Let's take a closer look at Neo-Confucianism. What is Neo-Confucianism? It became the dominant interpretation of Confucianism in the Song Dynasty, and these were the revivers of pure Confucian thought. What is there to revive? Well, we're starting in media res, but remember, the history spans a long time, far before the birth of Christ. And so we're already looking at post-classical Song here. The libraries were established and the old texts were being recovered. And what does Neo-Confucianism stress most importantly? Personal morality and regulation. The importance of philosophy is pragmatic in nature. They're not thinking about, does God exist? They're thinking about the pragmatic everyday relationships between people, and how to harmonize your own life and the moral codes that guide society and fuse it into harmony. There was a general hostility at this time during the Neo-Confucian period to foreign ideas because Buddhism and Taoism were considered superstitious. They were not things that dealt with the things of this world, the things that are more pragmatic, the things that seemed important to social cohesion, right? And so gender distinctions, class distinctions, age distinctions were very much reinforced and emphasized at this time period in Song China in the Neo-Confucian tradition because they thought women should behave a very specific way, men should be a very specific way, the relationship between parents and children should be analogous to the relationship between the rulers and the ruled, and so on. A point to note is that Japan, Korea, and China are very, very different at this time period, and they will remain so for the rest of human history, although Korea will sometimes vacillate back and forth, getting closer and then further away as history progresses. But in Japan, you had Shinto shamanistic traditions. In Korea, you had Muism, shamanistic tradition. And these are very different local shamanistic traditions that eventually, however, became syncretized with the Chinese cultural tendencies that spread. Specifically, Neo-Confucianism spread through Korea to Japan, and it was very widely accepted in Korea, not as much in Japan, however. So we're going to see how those changes occur. Now we look at the papermaking techniques, the abacus, the movable type, and how the rise of Neo-Confucianism, this rise of a relatively more pragmatic system of not just governance, but relating to people in general and social cohesion, it changed the landscape of culture, right? Art itself became more realistic in nature rather than depicting giant bodhisattvas. You would have nature become very common in poetry and art. You had opera houses and secular scenes. The scholars became the cultural producers rather than the Buddhists. There was a lot of urban growth and sophistication. Now, if you see it, the image of this paper money, right? There was paper money called flying money that was developed during this time by the Song. There were canal systems that expanded trade, right? Because remember, at this time, the waterways are much faster and easier ways to trade bulk items. And so canal systems were developed between the different major trading cities, which you should know and try to remember in your head as we just go along. Urban growth, there were a lot of cities that were growing at this time. There was a lot of sophistication in these cities Chang'an, which was the Tang capital. There were 2 million people there. It was the largest city in the world at its time. Hangzhou, which was the southern Song capital. You had restaurants, opera houses, gardens, and parks. It was very much a city as we envision it today. The popular items for export were textiles such as silk and porcelain, which was known by the West as China, and that continues to this day. Now let's look at the Ming Empire very briefly. The burst of unusual empire-sponsored trading expeditions by Admiral Zheng He. Very, very important. You have to know Admiral Zheng He. He's mentioned repeatedly in the CED of the College Board. Right? He carried out expeditions along the coastline. There were excellent maps, and he improved the compass. He visited Africa and the Middle East. Just know that at this time period, Zheng He was one of the major travelers and traversers of the world by ship. Right? He sailed from China to the Middle East and the mid-eastern coast of Africa. But why did this trend of expansion not take root? Why are we going to see China involve itself less and less in its global affairs after 1450? Because China essentially ended up closing itself up. And we see that trend, we're going to see it more closely. But for example, in Korea, they called it Haeguk. In Japan, they called it Sakoku. And these trends of isolating themselves from the world stage and sheltering themselves and becoming more and more insular and xenophobic, that was when Europe started expanding. And we're going to see that in the unit that pertains to maritime empires being established and maintained. Now, let's look at the illustrative examples that are given by the CED of the College Board. Cultural traditions, filial piety in East Asia. What is piety? It means that you're loyal to your parents, you understand and love and worship your parents. And this is a cultural tradition that continues to this day and is esteemed by some and reviled by some. But essentially, there was a lot of ancestor worship going on. It's called ancestor worship, where you respect your elders and you build shrines to your elders and you try to communicate with the spirit of your ancestors and things like that. You respect what your parents try to tell you to do. You have a respect for tradition, that kind of thing, right? And so you need to remember Neo-Confucianism and Buddhism in East Asia. There were Confucian traditions of both respect for and expected deference from women, right? And so misogyny in world history takes different forms at different places at different times. You need to sort of understand exactly what was expected of women. For example, during the Song Dynasty, that was when foot binding started. It's an awful, awful practice of taking high-ranking girls and binding their feet so that their feet were essentially deformed and these women couldn't go far. Of course, it was different for women that were not of the higher classes. There's always going to be this polarity, and we're going to explore that more. The Chinese literary and scholarly traditions of Neo-Confucianism spread to Heian, Japan, and Korea. You're going to have to want to remember the trajectory of that spread, how that spread occurred. Now, something you definitely have to remember is there are 3 main branches of Buddhism. What are they? Theravada, Mahayana, and then the Vajrayana. Vajrayana, also called Tibetan Buddhism. Theravada is the oldest branch of Buddhism, and it is closest to the original teachings. It's taught by monks and traders. Let's just take a brief flashback to the original teachings of Gautama Siddhartha, who was the founder of Buddhism, right? And Gautama Siddhartha, he wasn't East Asian though, right? You're right. He was an Indian prince. So Buddhism actually started in India, but it didn't catch on because the Hindu caste system was so rigid. And Buddhism is essentially an egalitarian and equalizing religion, emphasizing meditation, emphasizing the abnegation of secular affairs and things of that nature. And so it didn't really catch on that much in India proper, and it really just found its heyday in East Asia at this time, and it continued to spread, mostly along the trade routes especially. We're going to see that. Mahayana is Eastern Buddhism, and it emphasizes Buddha as the savior. Buddha in the Bodhisattva is shown as huge and oversized and being all-knowing and powerful. It's like a salvation type of version of Buddhism, right? And Vajrayana, or Tibetan Buddhism, believes in the Dalai Lama. You may have seen the Dalai Lama on TV with like his very nice smile and his glasses and so on. But so the Dalai Lama is a reincarnation of Buddha on Earth, and so you have a lot of rituals and meditations and magical energies. They believe that the Dalai Lama reincarnates over and over and over again. I believe right now there are 2 Dalai Lamas in the world, and that's another very interesting issue. Technological innovations. You're going to have to know about champa rice. What is champa rice? Champa rice was a rice that was easier to harvest and quicker to harvest than previous types of rice that had been harvested throughout this area, and it gave rise to an explosion in population, an explosion in, if you have a lot of food to go around, you're going to have a lot more people not starving to death, right? So that was an innovation that was good. And then you have transportation innovations like the Grand Canal expansion, which we talked about briefly. Steel and iron production really escalated, and then you had textiles and porcelains for export. Now, Japan at this time period, because it's an island, and this is a trend that we see with islands that start out super insular and then go very expansionist, like the UK, right? But so at this time, Japan didn't so much influence the outside world. It received a lot of influences, and there was a lot of battling and feudalism within its borders. And Heian Japan at this time, Heian means like peaceful and harmonious. Heian Japan had a very developed court culture, and it was based upon codes of behavior and aesthetic enjoyment and almost hedonism, but also harmony at the same time. You had literary golden age of poetry and love notes and stories, and women and men took equal part in literary production. Chinese literary traditions, especially the narrative tales, spread to Japan. So you have things like Lady Murasaki's Tale of Kenji and a very distinctive Japanese style of art. But then the growing isolation of the court provided a lot of opportunities for regional lords that were more military, that were more belligerent, to seize effective control of Japan. So you had these bushi, these regional lords, administering small kingdoms, collecting taxes, and building up private militaries, very similar to what was going on in feudal Europe, parts of feudal Western Europe at the time. You had samurai, who were the armed military troops, which you've definitely heard about, and they were salaried. They received salaries from the lords that they were pledging their alliance to. And then they began as loyal warriors to the bushi. Martial arts were very much esteemed even at this time. The code of Bushido, very similar to the code of chivalry in Western Europe, stressed family honor as well as ritual suicide, which is like you take a sword and you are like, I will not be dishonored, and you slice your own guts out, and that's a honorable way to die, apparently. At this time period, however, it was considered a respectable way to go. Rather than defeat or rather than suffer ignominy or dishonor, you would just off yourself. The samurai were encouraged to be very loyal because, you don't bite the hand that feeds you. The serfs, however, they lost their status and their freedom as the society was becoming increasingly hierarchical, as it became more and more stratified into these different class distinctions, and they were treated like the property of the local lords. And, it's this very famous, or infamous rather, situation where if a serf or a peasant so much as looked at a samurai the wrong way, the samurai would just slice off his head, and that would be okay for them to do. It was a very bad time to be a serf. Life gets hard. What do? You turn to faith, and they turned increasingly to Salvationist Buddhism, this idea that you should live a pure life on earth. And Salvationist Buddhism was used as a way to control the populace. However, Japan's Shinto, even to this day, and this syncretized version of Salvationist Buddhism with those Shinto beliefs persisted, and to this day, they still do. Now let's look a little bit more closely at the social stratification, Japanese feudalism. It meant what? It meant that centralized emperor power declined, and by the 11th and 12th centuries, which we're looking at now, aristocratic families dominate and are in control at court. We're looking at the fallout of that, specifically 1200. It's a little bit after. But so we're contextualizing that during the Kamakura period of 1185 to 1336. And then you had, from 1180 to 1185, you had the Kempei Wars. But when you look at these dates, you don't have to commit all of these dates to memory. You're going to have some dates that are more important than others. The central thing is to remember what came before something else and what came after something else, right? Just so you don't make that anachronistic mistake when you're writing your essay, for example. And so just remember the Japanese feudalism, right? But we're taking you through a little bit more of the context to make it a little bit more detailed for you. You know, it's more interesting when it's detailed that way. But always remember, the main important thing to remember is Japanese feudalism. Right. Okay, so the Taira and the Minamoto families fought over political control of Japan. The Minamoto won, and they controlled the court. The Kamakura shogunate from 1192 to 1333, exactly the time period we're looking at now. Minamoto established a bakufu, a military government, headed by a shogun, military leader. The emperor and the court did remain, but the Minamoto family and the samurai were the ones that had real control in the shogunate. Well, what was happening in Korea at this time? Koryo, which is the origin of the name for Korea, was an ally of the Song dynasty and warding off the Khitan and the Jin of the north. And so whenever you see China consolidating its power into this one singular group, you're going to have those, they called them barbarians, right, of the north, but really they were the Central Asiatic nomadic peoples. They were the Central Asian nomadic peoples, the Mongols, the Khitan, the Jin, the Uyghurs. You're going to see a lot of those people, and throughout Chinese history, throughout the history of East Asia, you're going to have that constant tension between the Central Asian nomads and the more agricultural settled societies, or the urbane societies of China and Korea. Japan, not so much, because Japan is relatively sheltered from those kinds of impacts. Buddhist culture and art, as well as Neo-Confucian thought, flourished in Goryeo. Jikji, the first movable metal type, was invented in Korea, and that's the picture you see at the bottom left. And society was stratified into a proto-feudal system. It was kind of like something between China and Japan, but it was also sort of uniquely its own. It had hereditary slaves called nobi at the bottom, and then you had agricultural and artisanal classes in the middle. Goryeo period, you had this growing merchant class that had a lot of active trade, especially in celadon, which is pottery and paper production, as well as silk. You had a small elite bureaucratic class, and then you had a monarchy reminiscent of and influenced by the Song, but there was a lot more of a Buddhist and even a Taoist slant to the particular politics of Goryeo Korea. Now we're looking at developments in Dar al-Islam. And Dar al-Islam, the region pertains to what we now know as the Middle East, Anatolia, parts of North Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula. Remember that we're starting in media res. So at this time period, we're looking at the Abbasid Caliphate, which has been around for a while, and the Buyids of Persia, the Seljuk Turks, and the Mamluk Sultanate. Let's look at what the CED of the College Board wants us to know about this area at this time period. In terms of governance, as the Abbasid Caliphate fragmented, new Islamic political entities emerged, and a lot of these were dominated by Turkic peoples. Continuity, innovation, and diversity. The College Board really wants you to know about that, but fill in the blanks. What exactly does continuity, innovation, and diversity mean, right? These are words that can be used anywhere. A caliphate essentially refers to, like, a kingdom is ruled by a king. A caliphate is ruled by a caliph, and a caliph is a type of leader at this time period, like a head of state at this time period. Muslim rule continued to expand to many parts of Afro-Eurasia due to military expansion, and Islam subsequently expanded through the activities of merchants, missionaries, and Sufis. From its inception, ever since Islam began, you had tax benefits, you had a lot of trading, and so these Islamic cultures, they tended to spread Islam through peaceful means as much as possible. But then, of course, you would also have the more militant, more fundamentalist Muslims who would advocate jihad or sacred war. But generally, Islam expanded mostly through merchants, because Islam tended to be espoused in civilizations that developed relatively early on and continued to expand through trade routes. You had Islam spreading through trade routes. And then you had the Sufis, who were more mystic in nature. When we look at the cultural developments and interactions, you have Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, and the core beliefs and practices of these Abrahamic religions continuing to shape societies throughout Africa and Asia. When we look at technology and innovation, these Muslim states and empires encouraged significant intellectual innovations and transfers. You're going to have to remember that. And also keep in mind just the Crusades happened, and then the Cordoba Caliphate existed in Al-Andalus, which is current-day Spain and Portugal, right? That's going to have an impact on how Isabella and Ferdinand, for example, decide to finance Christopher Columbus, who expands the scope of the quote-unquote known world and aids and abets in the destruction of native cultures in the Americas. So everything is connected, and that's where you see the causation. History is so fun. All right, so how did Islam spread? Islam spread rapidly because it was able to transcend tribal and regional divisions in Arabia. It was, much like Buddhism, an equalizing force. Everyone was equal before God. So that's the central difference that you should focus on when we're looking at Buddhism and comparing it with Islam. They're both equalizing forces. But in Buddhism, you find the divinity within yourself through meditation and peace, and unless, of course, you're more of the Mahayana bent, in which case you kind of worship the Bodhisattva, but there's still that element of meditation going on. But Islam, you have an all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, absolute God, this higher divine power, and everyone is equal. Before him, everyone is equally just not as significant, than God. Allah is almighty in Islam. And so that's the major methodological difference theologically, but I mean, they're both equalizing forces. And so it was hugely popular. It erased divisions between, at the beginning, it erased divisions between men and women. Not so much after the Abbasid Empire. We're going to get to that. Anyway, it spread, and you can see its appeal. It spread throughout the military and trade-based expansion of the Islamic Empire. The Sunni Muslims became the majority. Now, after Muhammad's death, again, this was during the classical period, so it's not really in our time frame because we're starting in media res, but after Muhammad's death, immediately after the Prophet himself passed away, you had this division between his supporters, and the supporters that supported his wife's father and his daughter's husband. There's a lot of theology that goes into it. There's a lot of history and culture and age-old rifts that go into it, but for now we're focusing on just the fact the Sunni Muslims, they were the majority, they were supporting Abu Bakr, and the rightly guided caliphs established Muslim control. The Umayyads conquered a lot and expanded, but they lost legitimacy eventually through extravagant lifestyles, and then the Abbasids rebelled and overthrew them. That's where we're starting with the Abbasids. The Abbasids' capital was in Baghdad. It's ancient city. And in the mid-9th century, the Abbasids began to lose control over their vast empire. The caliphs became increasingly dependent on advisors. Now, remember, in Japan, in feudal Japan, you had the Bushi gaining power, and then you had the shogun gaining power. Then the emperor's power was kind of whittled down because he had to negotiate his status. Likewise with the caliphs and their advisors. If absolute power starts sort of giving out its power to its surrounding councilmen or its advisors, these advisors are going to increase in power. And so there was a lot of luxurious living and a lot of civil wars, and the treasury was drained, taxes increased, and when taxes increase, the peasants revolt. And so the Shia revolts, the assassination attempts against Abbasids just really unsettled this empire. Mercenary armies increased because there were wars going on all the time. Professional soldiers that were paid and hired to serve in an army, those are mercenary armies, kind of like Wagner Group in Ukraine and Russia these days. So it was aggressive, it created a lot of social unrest, it was expensive, and the caliphs attempted to build new cities and modernize old ones at the same time. It was extremely expensive time. And when it comes to the treatment of women, Islam was essentially an equalizing religion at the beginning until the Abbasid period, when the freedom and the influence of women declined. Harems secluded women. Abyssinian society was patriarchal and polygamous. Sharia law, actually, the sacred law of the Islamic script, mandated that widows should be taken care of, that women should be taken care of, and, that was sort of taken a little bit too literally. At this time period, women began to be mandated into wearing veils and shielding women from the gaze of men, and Abbasid wealth generated a large demand for concubines and female slaves. When you have power, you abuse it, you get away with it, it exacerbates, and that's what happened at this time period. The Mongols, who were the Central Asian nomadic invaders, were a threat to Islamic lands at this time period from the point of view of the Muslim world. Now, again, because this is a speed review, I'm not going into all of the nitty-gritty, but if there's something that piques your interest, I want to encourage you, especially after the test, to really pursue that rabbit hole, right? And just dive right into whatever it is that intrigues you the most, because there's probably a reason for it. But right now we're just sort of glossing over a lot of things. There may be some things in this summary that you don't agree with, and that's okay. That's actually excellent and amazing and wonderful. Dive into the comments. I want to hear your different perspectives. I want to hear what perplexes you, what confuses you. Maybe if you're from a different country and you had this completely different narrative that was given to you by your home country, there are probably these subtle differences that are completely amplified in the halls of discourse of history majors and people that actually really look at the artifacts and the primary sources and things like that. Have at it in the comments. I mean, I'm so excited to hear what your differing opinions are. But let's go on to the Mongols, right? The Central Asian nomadic invaders. They were a threat to Islamic lands. Chinggis Khan destroyed the Turkish-Persian kingdoms that were east of Baghdad in the 1220s, and his grandson Hülgu continued the assault on the center of Islamic civilization. In 1258 CE, you had the last Abbasid caliph, the 37th to be exact, be executed when Baghdad was invaded by the Mongols. Let's look at the Buyids, the Seljuk Turks, and the Mamluk Sultanate in a little bit more depth. As you can see, they're mostly centered around Anatolia and the Arabic Peninsula. Well, the Buyids were from Persia, which is present-day Iran, and the Buyids of Persia captured Baghdad in 945 CE. They were Shia, by the way. They rejected the Sunni ideas of the Abbasids, and the Abbasid caliphs essentially became powerless. They were controlled by Buyid sultans, and sultan means victorious in Persian, and so you had that tension going on after 900 CE. But in 1 century, the Seljuk Turks broke Buyid control in 1055 CE. So the Seljuks were Muslim nomadic invaders from Central Asia. They were very staunch Sunnis. They eliminated Shia Buyid sultans and eradicated Buyid influence. The Seljuks were successful rulers very briefly until they were defeated by Byzantine forces. Now, for some reason, the College Board doesn't really emphasize Byzantium and all its influences, but if you're into history, again, I'm actually thinking of making like a separate video on that. Definitely feel free to chase your compulsive curiosity. So Saladin was a successful ruler who fought the Western Crusaders and recaptured most of the Holy Land from Europe. So it's very interesting when you see the Crusades from the Muslim point of view and then the European point of view. Now let's look at the Mamluk Sultanate. The Mamluks were slave soldiers from Central Asia who were brought to Egypt, and in the chaos of the Crusader attacks and the Mongol attacks on the Abbasids, the Mamluks were able to control Egypt, and they established Cairo as the main city. They prevented the Mongol conquest of Syria, Egypt, and Medina and Mecca, and craftsmanship, architecture, and scholarship flourished there until they were ultimately defeated by the Ottomans. Okay, so this is just a map of the 4 crusades that occurred in the span of time between 1095 to 1289. In 1095 CE, West European Christian crusaders invaded Muslim territory because they wanted the biblical Holy Land. They wanted Jerusalem for themselves. At this time, you're going to be looking at how Europe is really in what some people call the Dark Ages. Again, we're going to get into that in subsequent units, but Europe was very fervently Christian at this time. They were so Christian that they renounced all of their former pagan myths and their pagan gods and their pagan philosophers and their pagan science, and they didn't want to have anything to do with anything other than the Christian faith, and they had a very dogmatized, very simplified idea of what it meant to be devoted to their Christian God. They wanted Jerusalem. They wanted the Holy Land of the Scripture. There was a lot of chaos from the Buyid and Seljuk invasions at the time in the empire, and that made the Crusader invasion simpler than it would otherwise have been. And as a result of the Crusades, what happened? The Europeans recovered all the lost Greek learning that had been preserved by the Muslim theoreticians, the Muslim mathematicians, the Muslim scientists, the Muslim theologists. They had been studying these amazing works of Greek philosophy and tradition and science by Aristotle and Plato, and they had the works of Homer, and they had all of the European literary compendium and the science and development and achievement of Rome in their libraries. And Europeans were like, what is this? Like, this statue kind of looks like us. And they realized, wait, are these our ancestors? Whoa, this is awesome. And then they just like rediscovered everything that Europe had lost for centuries to this grueling regime of being just dogmatically devoted to God. And so you have these crusades influencing how European thought develops over the next few centuries. Now let's look at the mathematical, scientific, cultural, and literary developments at this time period. Although there was a lot of political decline and a lot of social turmoil, there was a lot of urban affluence. And when you have a lot of cities and a lot of urbanity, what happens? You have a lot of explosions of inventiveness, and you have a lot of cross-pollination between the different people that are constantly doing their own thing and coming up with new ideas to look at and view and interpret and do different things. You have intellectual and artistic creativity exploding in the Abbasid age. You had a lot of expanding trade and intellectual creativity at schools, libraries, institutes in Cairo, Baghdad, and Cordoba by the 12th century. This is why, by the way, remember Cordoba, the Cordoba Caliphate is in Spain and Portugal. That's why Spain and Portugal don't really fall into the Middle Ages like the rest of Western Europe do, but they kind of have like the very sort of intensified form of it during Ferdinand and Isabella's time period, like the Spanish Inquisition, which we all know is very infamous for, trying to compensate for this time period in general. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad was established by Harun al-Rashid, who was the fifth Abbasid Caliph, and there was a lot of ancient Greek, Roman, and Persian knowledge that was preserved and fact-checked by Muslims, by the way. Keep in mind, Islam is the religion. Muslim refers to the people or the culture or the ones who espouse Islam. So Islamic and Muslim are both like adjective forms of Islam. Just think of it that way. Persian essentially refers to the language that is called Farsi today, or an older version of it anyway. But Farsi is the language that they speak in Iran now, and that can be traced back to Persian. Okay, now let's look at math. There were a lot of mathematical developments, especially by Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, who developed geometry, algebra, and trigonometry. Of course, he was influenced by people like Euclid, these ancient Greek philosophers, and ancient Greek mathematicians, because philosophy, religion, and math were all more or less the same thing in ancient Greece, right? You had an Indian system of numbers that was brought to the Middle East by caravan traders, and to this day, we utilize, for example, the number 0, which is a very intense philosophical concept that people didn't really think about until this. Science also dramatically improved. There were a lot of astronomical instruments, medicine, and hospitals. There was an explosion of interest in astronomy. There was the refined astrolabe that measured the position of the stars. Nasir al-Din al-Tusi created an academy in Tabriz. He provided the model for the movement of the planets, and later that would inspire the Copernican model of the solar system. You had this increased interest in optics. You had surgeries taking place at this time. You had a lot of paper making going on in general, and that scientific knowledge was aided and embedded and developed directly and indirectly by the prescriptions of the Muslim faith, for example, of Islam. For example, when you have to dictate that you have to bow to Mecca like a certain amount of times a day, or you have to fast for Ramadan, what do you need? You need a really good calendar, and you need a really good compass, and you need to know where everything is. You need to know where Mecca is, right? And so you have this way of situating yourself in the world that is inherently conducive to the development of science and math, and that was a good thing for the culture culture at this time period. Persian replaced Arabic as the language of the Abbasid court after the Buyids gained power, and so it became the language of high culture, and Arabic became the language of religion, law, and the natural sciences. So there's that little divide there. There was an amazing literary tradition that emerged in this time period. Firdausi's epic text, Shahnameh, was a history of Persian kings from the creation to the Islamic conquest. You had 1001 Arabian Nights being written here. The female author Aisha al-Baunia was an Islamic mystic and poet, and there was a lot of calligraphy and arabesques illustrating poetry and writing, and in architecture you had minarets being built atop mosques. Now, if we look at the ulama, the religious scholars, they became increasingly more conservative and suspicious of non-Muslim influences in scientific thought. Whenever you have power consolidating in the hands of a few, especially when it comes to the power to manipulate knowledge and information transfer, they're going to become increasingly fundamentalist and fervent and conservative and dogmatic and weird. That kind of happened with the ulama here. Much like Neo-Confucians distrusted Taoist thought and Buddhism in general. They disliked Muslims utilizing Greco-Roman knowledge. They associated it with the aggressive crusader culture. And the Sufis, on the other hand, they became increasingly interested in mysticism, spirituality. They sought personal union with Allah, and the whirling dervishes that we know that are so emblematic of Turkish culture. It's a culture where you would think Allah, Allah, you would sort of spin yourself into this state of semi-delirium, of connection with the universe and the atoms and Allah and everything, and it was very mystical and very, very spiritual, right? Sometimes they would use drugs, but generally it was meditation, songs, and dancing, like whirling dervish. So whereas Buddhist monasticism focused on eliminating sensory input and sort of eliminating the distractions that sort of sensory input and emotional input would place fetters on the mind in different ways, the Sufis, the whirling dervishes, for example, they would sort of amplify and maximize that intense sensory input until they were just sort of spinning into this state of connection and oneness. This altered state of consciousness, right? They gained reputations as healers and miracle workers, because why wouldn't they? Rapid urban growth and prosperity lasted until late in the Abbasid era. The spread of Islam helped to create trade connections between various regions. Employment opportunities for skilled individuals remained abundant, and where there are jobs, skilled people are going to come. Merchants were very wealthy. Long-distance trade flourished from Western Mediterranean areas all the way to China, and the artists were creating mosques and palaces and tapestries, rugs, bronzes, jewelry, and ceramics. These are the trade routes that you see on the map. Now let's look at developments in South and Southeast Asia. By South and Southeast Asia, we're referring to the Indo-Malay archipelago, India, Indochina in general, and Polynesia as well. So the College Board course exam description says that you should focus on governance, cultural interactions, and developments, and illustrative examples. You want to look at the Hindu and Buddhist states that emerged at this time in South and Southeast Asia. As Buddhism spread and as Hinduism sort of bred and manifested into its different forms, such as Bhakti, you had new states emerging in South and Southeast Asia. Hinduism, Islam, and Buddhism, as well as their core beliefs and practices, they continue to shape societies in South and Southeast Asia. You want to know the Bhakti movement, you want to know Sufism and Buddhist monasticism, as well as the Vijayanagara Empire, the Srivijaya Empire, the Rajput Khmer, Majapahit, Sukhothai, and Sinhala. All right, so let's look at a comparison of Buddhism, Islam, and Hinduism. Buddhism was open and tolerant of other religions. There were multiple forms of the Buddha that were admissible. They were proselytizing in general, and proselytizing just means they would have missionaries or people that would die to spread the faith and stuff. And you have a lot of Buddhist martyrs at this time emerging. In terms of society, Buddhism had this belief that all individuals were equal, right? Remember, it's an equalizing type of religion, and it renounced caste. Islam, however, even though it was egalitarian, this idea that everyone was equal under God, was monotheistic. So you could not have other forms of Allah. Allah is one. You have one God, and that's Allah, and anything else is blasphemy. They were very proselytizing. Hinduism was relatively open, tolerant, polytheistic, and inclusive of widely varying forms of religion. So if your god has like 9 heads and my god has 2, we don't fight. We just acknowledge it and move on, right? And so why would there be an emphasis on proselytizing either? Because, your god and my god can be different, and our gods don't care, we don't fight, right? But they had a rigid caste system at the time, and this is the Hindu caste system pyramid: the Sudra at the bottom, the Vaishya, the Kshatriya, and then the Brahmin at the tippy top, right? And so this was a very rigid caste system. You were born into it, it was inherited, there was nothing you could do about it until Bhakti, which was an offshoot or a reform of Hinduism, emerged in the 7th century CE in South India, and Bhakti means devotion or devotional love. And this sort of promoted an alternative path to salvation through devotion. So you didn't have to sacrifice 2 lambs and a goat in order to be saved, whatever it meant in your religion to be saved, because they had different types of gods and different rituals and different religions within this vast compendium of the Hindu pantheon. It was enormously popular because it empowered the people in the lowest segments of the caste system, and it emphasized the individual's direct connection to gods, much like how Martin Luther and his Protestant reform would lead to people realizing that they can actually connect to their higher power individually without the mediation of the Catholic Church. People started realizing, wait, I can just read this mantra a trillion times, and that'll be much better than having to pay my priest with 10 goats or something. So the Bhagavad Gita is one of the central bhakti texts, and it is now considered the defining movement of Hinduism today. This is a map showing the spread of Islam in the Indian Ocean. This is the kind of map that you should have burned into your retinas because it comes up so frequently on this exam, and it can very well be like a stimulus piece for your stimulus MCQs, right? So Islam continues to spread east after Islam is in India as a result of trading contacts and Sufi conversion efforts rather than militaristic jihad conquests, for example, right? You had a lot of Southeast Asian sailors and ships, and they interacted with Islamic traders a lot after the Muslims gained a lot of control over the Indian Ocean commerce, because whoever controls the power in a region controls the trade routes, and vice versa. And the Islamic strength was very mighty in the Indian Ocean. You had a lot of peaceful conversions. There were a lot of new believers combining elements of their local religions with Islamic teaching and rituals in this syncretizing religions. And Islamic law, Sharia law, ruled a lot of these legal transactions. Now let's look at the governments spanning from the Delhi Sultanate to the Majapahit empires. The Srivijaya Empire was succeeded by the Sultanate of Malacca. This is important because the Malacca Strait is a very tactical, very important location through which a lot of ships pass. And whenever you have a strait or some kind of narrow strip of water that passes through a strategic location that's otherwise landlocked, that's going to be a place that's very contentious. A lot of people are going to vie for power control over it. Let's look at the Sinhala dynasties. The Sinhala monarchies refers to the kings of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka was not ruled as a unified island. They had monarchs with absolute power, and they were supported by officials and ministers. Succession was hereditary, which meant you could only be born into power. After Buddhism was introduced, it became the predominant religious practice on the island, and you had Buddhist priests occupying a very central social and political role. In 1796, the British entered the island and gained control of the coastal areas. In 1815, Britain recognized the island as part of the British Empire, and this ended 2,357 years of independent Sinhala rule. Next, the Srivijaya Empire, which lasted from the 7th to the 12th centuries, was an empire in modern-day Indonesia, and they traded extensively with India and China. They controlled 2 main passageways, the Sunda Straits and, remember, the Strait of Malacca. It was cross-cultural. They incorporated Buddhism and Chinese political practices. They were very heavily Buddhist. The popular form was Vajrayana. This was popular because there was a lot of reliance on magic indigenously originally, and then you had this syncretic element there. The Srivijaya declined when Chola, the Indian dynasty, attacked them in 1025. Islam was spread there by the Chola. The Delhi Sultanate was created in 1206. It was an extensive Islamic state in the Indus Valley and north-central India, and it was led by Aibak. For the first time since the Guptas, North India had finally been unified. This is a society where Muslim rulers governed Hindu subjects, employed Hindus to govern over small communities, and although it was militarily powerful, the government was not very strong, and in 1298 they seized the trading state of Gujarat to increase success in the Indian Ocean trade. Next, let's look at the Vijayanagara Empire. They were a hugely wealthy empire, and they participated in Indian Ocean trade. Hinduism was promoted, and Bhakti was very active in the Vijayanagara Empire. They transcended regionalism by promoting this particular broadly common and popularized form of Hinduism that was relatively inclusive. The economy was based primarily on agriculture like sorghum, cotton, sugarcane, rice, and wheat. The Rajput kingdoms claimed descendants from 3 Hindu gods, the sun god, the moon god, and the fire god. They became an elite group of Indians who mostly were in the warrior caste. They never really fully united into one large kingdom because they were very loyal to their individual clans, and these were kingdoms in the northern half of India that were ruled or led by members of the Rajput, and they prevented total Muslim conquest in the early post-classical period until the Delhi Sultanate. And the significance of the Rajput kingdoms is that they helped keep power in northern India controlled by the elite classes and prevented Muslim consolidated power in the north at times. Now let's go on to Indochina, which is called so because it's between India and China. The Khmer Empire, also called the Angkor Kingdom, was a kingdom in Southeast Asia that ruled over Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam. It was founded by Jayavarman II in 802. Power was, again, hereditary, as in most cases at this time period. The capital was Angkor, and Angkor Wat, which you've definitely heard of, and if you have not, oh my goodness, go check it out right away. You can pause the video because it's so important that you know Angkor Wat. It's amazing and beautiful. You should visit it at least once in your lifetime. It was originally a Hindu temple, but then it was converted into a Buddhist temple, and it was actually added on to and converted by Jayavarman VII, who is considered the greatest king of the Khmer Empire, also called the Khmer Empire by Cambodians. The Khmer Empire was very agricultural. You had champa rice paddies supported by large irrigation and canal systems, and when you see irrigation and canal systems, what do we know? We know that there's a thriving centralized government there, because you would need something like that to be able to orchestrate such large construction works, right? So the kingdom began as Hindu, but it generally shifted gradually to becoming Buddhist, right? And Jayavarman VII, we know he ordered huge building projects such as highways, hospitals, monuments, and temples. A side note, by the way, you probably know this, but VII is not read VII. These are Roman numerals. V is 5, and when you have II to the right, that means 7, so you read it as 7, right? Now let's look at the Sukhothai Kingdom. The Sukhothai Kingdom lasted from 1238 to 1438. Just know that it's relatively contemporaneous to the Khmer Empire. Inherited a lot of its landmass as well as its populace. It was an empire in mostly modern-day Thailand, formed after a local revolt against the Khmer Empire. By the 14th century, they controlled most of modern-day Thailand, while eastern provinces remained under Khmer and Angkor rule. They were predominantly Hindu at this time, although Buddhism was practiced. Now let's look at the Majapahit Empire. The Majapahit Empire lasted from 1293 to 1527, and it was a Southeast Asian empire of 98 tributaries. You know, there are a lot of islands dotting that area. It was one of the last major empires for Southeast Asia. It's the precedent for modern Indonesia. You have a lot of tribes, a lot of different languages, a lot of natural beauty in that area as well. It was primarily a Hindu empire, though Buddhism was also practiced, and you had a well-organized bureaucratic structure there promoting an absolute king. And in the 14th century, you had a golden age with expansion and cultural growth. They primarily traded spices like clove, nutmeg, and cinnamon, and it was very agricultural over there. You had rice and bananas and coconut and so on. Next, we see the Indian Ocean trade. We're going to look a lot more at the Indian Ocean trade as these units progress. But unlike the Silk Roads at this time, transportation costs were much lower. Remember how shipping things in bulk by waterway is much cheaper and much faster and more economic than transporting things by camelback, right? If you were transporting things by camelback, you would have to protect your caravan constantly from these nomadic tribes. They're looking to seize the opportunity, right? There's a lot of value traveling into their lands, and they want a piece of that. They want a cut of that. And so the costs would accumulate as you would travel along the Silk Road through the deserts across the lands, and you could only have like small things that were very valuable, like gold and pearls and ivory and that kind of thing. But along the Indian Ocean, sure, there was gold along the Indian Ocean as well, but it was usually not as refined and delicate. It wasn't the kind of gold that was like artisanally made. It was just in bulk. You had a lot of salt, you had a lot of timber, you had a lot of gold, furs and ivory, things like that traveling up east from down west along the coast of Western Africa. And so it was also seasonal trading. So in the summer, the wind would blow northeast from the southwest, according to the monsoons, which are alternating wind currents. And the west coast of Africa, you would have all these raw materials being shipped up. And then in return, you would get Indian, Islamic, and Chinese luxuries down in the winter, blowing southwest from northeast. And the trade occurred between individual merchant towns. Trade was not really facilitated by major empires. Major empires did intervene or sometimes orchestrate something, but generally trade itself was carried out among these different towns, which led to the amazing diaspora and the diversity of multiple cultures and along the Indian Ocean basin. How did these ships travel? What kinds of ships were they? The Chinese junks, these huge ships with square sails, they were quite common, and the ship models had been refined in the late Tang and the Song. They established a lot of market networks along the Indian Ocean coast, and they led to exchanges of religious ideas and technologies. Of course, they used compasses because you need to know where you're going. And this is a map of the Indian Ocean trade route network at that time. Because trade and exchange was so time consuming, traders would tend to just like move to their destination and stay there or permanently settle. Usually they would get married there and have children and raise kids, diverse families. You had diasporic communities in the Indian Ocean emerging as a result. You had Arabs and Persians communities in East Africa along the Swahili coast. You had Chinese merchants in Southeast Asia, Malay communities in the Indian Ocean basin, and all of this led to such an exchange of religions, languages, and other forms of knowledge. Now we're looking at state building in the Americas. At this time period, between 1200 and 1450, the Americas refers to both North America and Latin America, including regions of Mesoamerica and the Caribbean. We're looking at Maya city-states, the Mexica, the Inca, the Chaco, Mesa Verde, and Cahokia civilizations. First, let's look at the Toltecs from 968 to 1150 CE. They were the precursors to the Aztecs. They were located in central Mexico. In 968, the capital at Tula was established, and there was a lot of long-distance trade, even to the American Southwest. They believed in Quetzalcoatl, who was the feathered serpent, and he was one of the main pre-Columbian gods. You see a lot of mention of him in the texts pertaining to this particular time period in this area. There was a lot of heavily militaristic war. There was a lot of sacrifice going on. And in 1150, there was a collapse probably caused by northern nomadic attacks. Now, some scholars say that human sacrifice was not as widespread at this time period as we have been learning in our history classes. If you have a differing opinion, please dive right into the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. But generally, the accepted knowledge is that there was a lot of human sacrifice going on, and we're going to see why very soon. If we look at the Aztecs, also known as the Mexica or the Mexica, between the 12th and the 15th centuries, after the Toltecs collapse, there was a lot of political power and people moving to the shores along Lake Texcoco. Lake Texcoco is great for fishing and farming and transportation, and it was inhabited by groups organized into city-states, and a lot of people vie for control of the lakes. Right? And the winners were the Aztecs. The Aztecs spoke Nahuatl, which is the Toltec language, and they worshipped Quetzalcoatl. And this religion, it lent legitimacy to their rule. In 1325, the Aztecs founded Tenochtitlan, which is a city on an island in the center of the lake Texcoco. Now, when you have a city in the middle of an island, what happens? You can't let your population expand too widely or too quickly. You have to have a method of population control. Some people say that that's where the human sacrifice element came in. Again, controversial. Why was it founded there? Because an eagle was sitting on a cactus there. In 1434, the Aztecs dominated the Central Valley and conquered other city-states to make a tribute empire in which you would demand financial payments and prisoners to use for human sacrifices. Now, if you think about it, this act of having human sacrifices, it was religious, it inspired devotion, but it also inspired a lot of fear, and it was a method of population control. It was a way of controlling the populace. It was a way of making sure that your tribute empire's tributaries listened to you and did what you told them to do. Let's look a little bit more closely at the Aztec religion, which is actually very, very fascinating. But let's just look at the basics. It was highly motivated by religious zeal. You had aristocrats that were using thorns to voluntarily puncture their ears and their lips and their tongue every single day because they genuinely believed that the sun would not rise if the sun did not taste blood. And the higher up your status was, the more valuable your blood was. And so there were actually a lot of human sacrifices that came voluntarily from the aristocratic class. And when you became a human sacrifice, you were venerated and you were worshipped almost like a semi-demigod. And so there was this constant theme of sacrifice on the battle, this flowery death you were going to. Very similar to Viking Valhalla, actually. It's very interesting how these cultures are all so similar. But you were dedicated to the service of the gods. The spiritual and the natural world were completely seamless. So the gods walked among us and we walked among the gods, and there were hundreds of deities. You had a pantheon of many, many, many different gods, but most of the gods were focused upon fertility, agriculture, and water and rain, like Tlaloc, who required the sacrifice of crying blind babies because more crying babies dying meant more rain for the harvest season, that kind of thing. Aztecs worshipped gods through festivals and ceremonies and feasting and dancing and warfare and sacrifice. And sacrifice was just another component of worship. It wasn't like bloody and gory. Well, it was bloody and gory. You would rip out the heart of a living person, but it was more ritualistic in nature. And Huitzilopochtli was the deity of war, sun, and the human sacrifice, and this was why the sun would not rise if it didn't taste blood, because Huitzilopochtli feeds on blood. He was the patron saint, or the patron god of Tenochtitlan. Ritual cannibalism, there was a market for human flesh as well. That was also kind of the case in ancient China. So, war captives supplied Aztecs with sacrificial victims. It's amazing what people do to each other throughout the course of human history. Now, as the Aztecs became solidified as the most powerful group around Lake Texcoco, Aztec society transformed into a very rigidly hierarchical society. You had the ruler, who was the head of state and religion, representative of gods on earth. And then you had the nobles, and then the peasants and the slaves, who were the war captives. And then you had the clans, the Kalpuli, who dictated social status. There was a large gap emerging between the nobility and the commoners, especially for Aztec women, right? Aztec women's responsibilities were household care, cooking, weaving, and women had to grind corn by hand on stone boards, and it was very time-consuming. Now, you didn't have wheels, and so there's been a lot of debate about why the ancient Aztecs didn't have wheels. Were they less developed than in Europe or in Africa? Like, it makes no sense. I mean, you just roll something and it rolls, and you can see that. And especially when you consider how amazingly advanced the ancient Aztec and Mayans were in other elements of their lives, you would think that this very advanced civilization would use wheels. But the theory goes, the accepted theory goes, that religion was so important and integral to these people's lives that, Huitzilopochtli, shape of the sun, round, right? If you put something round on the ground to use it as a tool so that it will roll, that's like a slap in the face of the sun god, who won't rise unless you give him blood every day. And so There's this idea that religion was such an entrenched part of these highly devout people's lives, and it was a very structured, very organized, very civilized society. Otherwise, also the terrain, it doesn't really lend itself well to roads and transportation vehicles that depend on wheels. Women could own and inherit property and will it to their heirs, and arranged marriages were common. The elite were often polygamous, commoners were monogamous. So that's another interesting development, because elite marriages tended to be more political in nature than for reasons of love. And generally, when people are left to their own devices, like for commoners, you tend to just sort of marry for love. It was mostly an agrarian community, and chinampas were man-made floating islands on the lakes that yielded a large amount of crops. They were constructed to provide additional farming. You still see chinampas in parts of this area to this day. You have additional farming land upon the lake, maize, corn, and beans, no use of wheel or laboring animals, but you had this amazing, incredible floating garden technology going on. Very fascinating contradictions. Merchants worked in daily markets, and you had these tribute lists showing what items tribute territories controlled by the Aztecs should send to the Aztecs. It was a way of organizing the tribute items, like common items were bird feathers, greenstones, or jade, or animal hides, and you had all of these valuable goods. Now let's look at the Inca Empire, which lasted from 1438 to 1572 CE. The Inca were Quechua-speaking clans from the southern Andes Mountains. So remember, in the present-day Mexico area, you have the Mexica, the Aztecs who speak Nahuatl, and then the Inca are on the southern Andes Mountains over there, and they speak Quechua, different language groups, right? And by 1350, the Incas lived centered around and in Cusco, the capital city. They controlled other regions by 1438, and they were led by the Pachacuti, the ruler, also called the Inca. The Inca is also the name of the ruler. They were centered around Lake Titicaca. They relied on fishing, irrigation, and farming, and there was aggressive expansion for 60 years by Pachacuti, his son, and his grandson. The techniques of the Inca were that they were highly centralized. They had an Inca ruler, the governors of 4 provinces. Local rulers maintained their positions provided they deferred to Inca rule. They integrated various ethnic groups into a tribute empire. Quechua was spread as the language that united the entire empire. We're going to see a lot of that, for example, in Africa. You have these groups that are connected more by language than anything else, and language truly becomes like the mediator of culture in situations like this. You had the military, you had an amazing system of roads, pay stations called tambos, and storehouses. You had a lot of irrigated agriculture and large building and irrigation projects in these very steep hillocks and mountainous regions of present-day Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and Chile. Next, we look at the Inca religion. Viracocha, the creator, the sun god, is the highest, and the temple of the sun at Cusco, pictured here, was the center of state religion. Viracocha, by the way, is the effigy that we see to the right. Local gods were allowed to survive whenever the Inca conquests resulted in a new tributary being conquered. There was a cult of ancestors, and deceased rulers tended to be mummified. Inca gods were animistic in nature, and you had cultural achievements like metallurgy, like copper and bronze. You had a very intricate system of knotted strings, quipu, for accounting, and it was similar to a writing system. There was a lot of monumental architecture like steep slopes, and then there was farming, potato and maize based mostly. Let's look a little bit more at the Inca Sun Temple of Cusco, which, by the way, is a node of spiraling, and we're going to see this again, the Coricancha. Right? The temple of Coricancha was dedicated to the Inca sun god Inti, and Inti provided for and powered all life on Earth, so they believed. Again, I mean, in South America, if you think about it, they have this radiant sun. It's not a far stretch to believe that the sun gives life to all things, and it's all powerful. And you can kind of understand how the Aztecs would believe that the sun demanded blood sacrifices, and the Inca sun god Inti was also considered all powerful. Inti was more benevolent than Huitzilopochtli, certainly. So in front of the temple of Coricancha, there would have been a life-size sculpture garden giving thanks to Inti, and it was the miniature Inca Empire, kind of similar to how ancient China also created those terracotta mini worlds, right? And You had maize cobs, Inca people, llamas, and we only know about it from descriptions. And unfortunately, the whole temple was covered with gold. But when the Spanish conquered the Inca, they destroyed everything except one wall after removing all the gold. And then they built the church of Santo Domingo over it. So this is where we see the church of Santo Domingo. It's just another church, but we hear wild descriptions of what it looked like back in its day. The Maya spanned 2000 BCE to 900 CE. Now remember, BCE is short for before the Common Era. This corresponds to BC, before Christ in the old nomenclature, and 900 CE refers to 900 Common Era, which corresponds to 900 AD, or Annus Domini in the old nomenclature. The Maya developed the most sophisticated writing system in the pre-Columbian Americas. They were an enormously important and dominant Mesoamerican civilization, and they were clustered in one geographic area. They lasted a very long time, very stable for a very long period of time. And at their peak, Maya may have reached 2 million people. And the Maya, they had this regional base. They were not an expansionist empire. The Maya were known for their art, their architecture, their mathematics, their calendar, and their very complex astronomical system. If you were around, or if you vaguely remember, you might want to think back to like when you were very young, but like in 2012 there was all this furor about how the world was going to end, how the Maya calendar was prophesying the end of the world in 2012, and that was not true. 2012 was the time period when, according to the Mayan calendar, you had the cycle of the world shifting, and that was what was going on. But there were some doomsday predictions there based on that. Just so you don't confuse the Maya with, for example, the Aztecs or the Inca. They were a very distinct, different civilization. The thing about Mayan city-states is that rulers were not well equipped to address trade issues or issues of food distribution, and so the Maya ended up collapsing around 900 CE, just before our first period starts. And so there was major political tumult, entire cities were abandoned overnight, there was overpopulation, there was a lot of drought, and that was why they floundered. Now we're looking at North America, and these are just the families of language groups. There are an estimated more than 200 languages in North America alone, with a plurality of tribes and different civilizations, interconnecting and interacting with each other, nomadic hunter-gatherer cultures or warring cultures, and each tradition had its rich oral history that was passed down from generation to generation. A lot of these were unfortunately lost after the civilizations were destroyed. Let's look at the Chaco Canyon, which started in 900 CE, and we're not sure when exactly it ended. It was the largest Anasazi community at Chaco Canyon. You do need to know about this. The CED demands it. And it had a population of about 15,000 people. They practiced hunting, trade, and irrigated agriculture. They had multiple-level, 5-story buildings that could hold over 800 people. There was tremendous labor, stone-cutting, masonry, and people lived here for about 350 years, beginning around 900 CE. This marked an explosion of activity across the region. Now, Mesa Verde started, we don't know, 1300 CE was probably when it was abandoned. These ancestral Puebloans, again also known as the Anasazi, resided in the Mesa Verde Canyon in Colorado, and these were agriculturalists who lived in Colorado, New Mexico, and the Arizona area. They were famous for the Mesa Verde cliff dwelling within a canyon, and it's known as a pueblo, a communal village of flat-roofed structures. Some of them were like 5 to 6 stories tall, and they were built into the side of the cliff using stone and mud mortar. Next, we're looking at the Cahokia civilization, which lasted until 1250 CE. It was probably abandoned at that time. We don't really know what happened there, but it was a Native American tribe that we call the Mississippians that resided in modern-day Ohio as well as the surrounding area. Economy was based on hunting and gathering and was supplemented by agriculture. Their largest settlement or city was called Cahokia, and it was north of Mexico. It had 30,000 people living there. Amazing at that time period. An enormous agglomeration of people. And so they built large mounds, both as burial sites and as platforms upon which temples and residences of chiefs were constructed. Now we're looking at state building in Africa at this time period. When we're looking at state systems in Africa, we're looking at Great Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, and the House of Kingdoms. There are many ways of looking at this vast continent. Africa can be divided into North Africa, West Africa, East Africa, Central Africa, and Southern Africa, or just North Africa and then Sub-Saharan Africa. So West Africa, East Africa, Central Africa, and Southern Africa, everything under the Sahara Desert can be called Sub-Saharan Africa. Why is the Sahara Desert so important? Because it's very difficult to traverse, right? And so it essentially is a prime example of how the environment directly shapes civilizations developing. It's probably a meme at this point that some people who don't know any better refer to Africa as a single country. It is not. Africa is a continent, as we know, and it is the largest continent in the world. All of the other continents could fit inside it comfortably, and then some. You have China fitting in Africa, United States, no joke, India. Doesn't even compare. Africa is the largest continent in the world, and it has the most diverse flora and fauna. It also has the most diverse population of people living in it still. When we look at pre-Islamic Africa, before Islam came to Africa, you see extremely diverse societies developing, and political unity was obviously difficult to attain because of the terrain, because of the mountainous regions and the deserts and the jungles and things like that. And you had Bantu being the primary language system. Oral traditions were passed down generation to generation, so you had very few written records, and a lot of the communities were pre-literate. They lacked a writing system. The religions tended to be animistic and polytheistic, and the economies varied by region. So in North Africa, you had Islamic trade routes and Mediterranean trade. In the sub-Saharan areas, you had agriculture and ironworking, tribes and herders. The Africans tended to exchange a lot of raw materials, especially salt, for manufactured goods. In parts of Africa, to this day, they use large bundles of salt instead of coinage or money. Now, before Islam actually arrived in Africa, you had a lot of stateless societies, like many small African communities being politically organized. There were some authoritarian and centralized empires, but they generally lacked concentration of power and authority. Authority and power normally was exercised by a ruler, and court was held by a council or families or community. It wasn't really a full-time job. Also, you had age cohorts that acted as political and social grouping. The general weakness of stateless societies is that you don't really have an organization to collect taxes, and so you don't have an effective military. You don't have a way to fund effective militaries, and you don't really have a consensus per se. You just have to listen to your elders, respect the general opinion of the council, right, of the court. And internal problems could be resolved by allowing dissidents to leave and establish new villages, like the Lions do. What happened when Islam reached Africa? Between 640 and 700, the Muslims moved west from Arabia across North Africa to spread Islam, and there were rapid conversions made by the Saharan nomads, the Berbers. This spread along the pre-existing caravan routes. In Maghreb, in northwest Africa, which is west of Egypt, it was Islamized. And between the 11th and 12th centuries, you had the Almoravids and Almohads, the ultra-conservative Muslim Berbers, growing in power. And of course, they were reformers. They were launching jihad, this holy war to spread and protect the faith. And the jihad doesn't necessarily mean violence or war by any means. It originally just means struggle, right? This constant struggle between the secular world, the profane world, and the holy destination of our souls and the holy sacred world of Allah and everything that Allah commands. And so when you were a lax Muslim, they would be angry and they would sort of wage war against you. The Almohads defeated the Almoravids, and then you had the Almohad Caliphate spanning 1121 to 1269. And so you see the map there of the Almohads. The West African kingdoms, you had the three main early West African kingdoms, Songhai, Ghana, and Mali. The Grasslands kingdoms is also what they're called. The West African kingdoms is what they're also called. And the Sudanic states is also what they're called. All of these terms mean the same thing. They refer to Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. The Sahel grasslands are the transition zone between the Sahara Desert and the savannas to the south. And in the savannas, you know, you've probably seen a lot of documentaries, animal documentaries, where you have zebras, and you have cheetahs, and you have lions, and you have this amazing wildlife that is being endangered by poachers and climate change. But anyhow, that transition zone there between the Sahara Desert of the camels and the savannas of the zebras, right? That's the Sahel grasslands. And the point of exchange between North and Sub-Saharan Africa, this was a very, very important region of commerce and trade and cultural expansion. These three kingdoms. So remember them. The Sahara Desert was not impenetrable. It was very much transversable, but you had to have good solid backing. You had to have the nomads on your side. You had to either be of a tribe that was traditionally allowed to travel in those lands, and then you had to have the wherewithal and the knowledge where the oases were, where the caravans could rest, and you had to have all this kind of know-how to be able to transverse it and survive, right? You were generally riding camels. The taming of the camel came about in previous time periods, but the creation of the camel saddle allowed the camel to carry a lot more without hurting, and it also allowed the trader to rest while the camel did most of the hard work. And you increased use of caravans, increased the amount of trade items as well as the safety of travelers and traders. African empires often expanded to control these various points along the trans-Saharan routes, as depicted in this picture, where you have these webs, almost like the nervous system of a human body, this trade network, and it has these little nodes where these lines intersect, right? In Marrakech, in Algiers, in Tunis, in Tripoli, Cairo, these are the major centers where trade would occur. So whoever controls the trade routes, whoever controls the main trade points, controls the power in that area, because where is the power accumulated? The power is accumulated along the trade routes. So if you controlled the trade routes, you could export your goods, you could purchase goods, and you could regulate, control the trade in your kingdom. Let's look a little bit more closely at the Ghana Empire and the Mali Empire. So the Ghana Empire spanned from about, that's a typo there, 300 CE to 1076 CE. It's located in modern-day Mauritania and western Mali, and it was the first great West African empire. There they would trade salt and gold, and in the 10th century, rulers converted to Islam. Well, common people remained loyal to polytheism, but at this time, converting to Islam was a political move that could aggrandize you in the eyes of the commoners. You could claim some kind of divine connection, but it was also sort of a strategic way to foster a closer connection with the more powerful, the more moneyed interests of the Islamic northern Africa, right? The Ghana Empire ended when the Almoravid armies invaded Ghana in 1076. Now, when we look at the Mali Empire, which lasted from 1230 to 1600 CE, they broke away from Ghana in the 13th century, and the economy focused mainly on agriculture and the gold trade. The traders would spread beyond West Africa, and it was a very wealthy empire. The Islamized state in the 13th century was when rulers converted to Islam. The mosques were built, public prayers were sent up, and then the founder Sundiata, who died in 1260, was called the Lion Prince. His is a real story of rags to riches. He was chased away by the usurpers who took over his father's throne and killed his tribal leader, and then he came back to power after raising a giant army, and he was called the Lion Prince. He divided society into clans with different jobs, and he created peace through loyalty. It was a very authoritarian, very strict regime as well, with crimes being severely punished, as the lions do. Right. Jenne and Timbuktu were the two main trading cities, and they were major cities of commercial exchange. You had scholars, artisans, merchants, mosques, libraries, and universities. It was mostly agricultural. Irrigation would take place along the Niger River. Polygamy was allowed because of the Islamic beliefs according to Sharia law, and also the ability to have children work. Now that we've looked at Sundiata, we cannot not discuss Mansa Musa. Mansa Musa is a guy you have heard of. Mansa means leader or king in the Mali Empire during that time, and so the ninth Mansa was named Mansa Musa. He was so rich. And so, I mean, some people say that this is a depiction of Sundiata, some people say that this is a depiction of Mansa Musa. I mean, it's an artist depiction of one of the Mali rulers, right? But so Mansa Musa was so rich, the ninth Mansa was so rich, that when he traveled to Egypt, he actually created inflation there because he would just travel around throwing gold left and right, quite literally. And so everywhere Mansa Musa went, he created a little economic crisis. And all of the gold of this region was just in this area in his empire, and he controlled all of the trade routes. He was an insanely rich man. Some people say his net worth has not been topped to this day. Even Jeff Bezos has not yet been able to top him. Now let's look at the Songhai Empire. It was independent from Mali in the 1370s, and it prospered as a trading state and a military power. It was founded by Sunni Ali in 1464. Sunni Ali was a great military leader who extended his rule over the entire Niger River Valley. The rulers practiced Islam while the people maintained polytheism, again, a common thing that we see in this area. The Muslims tended to be very wealthy, and they became merchants, they became elite, and Songhai remained dominant until it was defeated in 1591 by the Moroccans. Now let's look at the Hausa Kingdoms. The Hausa Kingdoms are a collection of city-states that were formed by peoples of northern Nigeria. These city-states were a loose confederation of sometimes collaborative, sometimes rival entities, as city-states do, like in the Maya, for example. They were formed following the demise of the Songhai Empire. They combined Muslim and local traditions in this syncretizing movement that we see all across the world, and it was an important kingdom, extremely important in the trans-Saharan trade route. They traded leather, gold, salt, cloth, animal hide. Now let's look at Great Zimbabwe and East Africa, particularly the Swahili coast. Great Zimbabwe was a very large non-Islamic site, and at its peak in the 14th century, it supported 18,000 inhabitants. Royals would live in a double-walled stone structure known as the Great Enclosure. The walls are very, very thick, thicker than most houses are today. The city was very, very wealthy. They dominated the gold sources and the trade with all the coastal ports, and the community was otherwise highly agricultural. They traded along the Indian Ocean coast, especially the East African Indian Ocean coast. We see here Great Zimbabwe in purple on that map. These trading cities, these ports, are hugely important. They were Islamized trading ports along the coast. By the 13th century, they were very powerful, and a lot of the merchants converted. There was financial motivation to do so. It was just easier to trade if you were a Muslim at this time period in this area. Ibn Battuta, the famous Islamic scholar and traveler who visited all these cities, referred to them as Muslim cities, but the way he described them, if you read some of Ibn Battuta's travelogues, he wasn't very happy about how the women didn't wear veils. The women were freely conversing with the men, and some of them even owned shock property. So the type of Islam that was practiced here was probably a lot laxer than Ibn Battuta, for example, would have liked. But that just goes to show how, in terms of gender and society, equality was relatively higher along this particular coastline. The Swahili language emerged at this time as a mixture of Bantu and Arabic, and it emerged in these urbanized trading ports. And this is another example of syncretism in language, not just in religion. You have this merging of different cultures, and it's really quite beautiful. The Swahili civilization was a set of commercial city-states stretching along the East African coast, as we see here. We see Zaila, Berbera, Ras Hafun, Mogadishu, Lamu, Malindi, Mombasa, Pemba Island, Zanzibar Island, and Kilwa, and Sofala. And then we see Madagascar, of course. And so each city-state was politically independent with its own king. You had sharp class distinctions in each city-state, a huge gap between the merchant elite class and the commoners. Now let's look at Ethiopia from the 1st to 7th century CE. This particular area was known as the Kingdom of Aksum, and it was a link between the Arab and the Mediterranean world. Ethiopia developed as a region that was exposed to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and to this day they have a very unique Christian religion. At this time period, there were a lot of traders in this region. It was a strategic location where you could access Indian Ocean trade, Silk Road trade, and Trans-Saharan trade. The Bantu migrations in Central Africa you do need to know in terms of contextualization, even though technically they don't pertain to our time period that we're talking about. The Bantu agrarian societies migrated from the Congo area to the south and the east because of drought, famine, population increase. They needed to find fertile land, and then they had a lot of tribal conflicts and disease. There were positives and negatives to that. The positives included introduction of ironwork throughout South and East Africa. There were new crops introduced like bananas and yams. Yummy. The centralized system of government was introduced to replace stateless societies, and then they had agriculture. They had enough food to eat and store for the future, and so where there is agriculture, there is civilization emerging. The negative results were that there was a lot of cultural absorption and intermarriage with other groups, and so there was relatively a loss of culture, a loss of cultural consistency and diversity. Some of the Bantu languages died out and were replaced with this syncretic language, Swahili. Now let's look at developments in Europe at this time period. The CED requires you to know that the developments in Europe you want to focus on are centered around governance, cultural developments and interactions, and social interactions and organization. Europe was politically fragmented and characterized by decentralized monarchies, feudalism, and the manorial system. Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and the core beliefs and practices of these religions continued to shape societies in Europe. So you want to know about those cultural developments and those social interactions. Social interactions and organization. Europe was largely agricultural, dependent on free and coerced labor, including serfdom. So the Middle Ages implies that there's this lull between the glory of Rome and the glitter of the Renaissance. It's also called the medieval period. Sometimes it's also called the Dark Ages. I don't agree with that characterization. The Middle Ages are amazing, and here's why. You had the fall of Western Rome in the 5th century, and then the decline of Europe's feudal and religious institutions in the 15th century. You have that time period, and in that time period, what happens? Europe comes into its own. In the early Middle Ages, between the 5th and the 10th centuries, this was a period of decline, backwardness, and vulnerability, but it was also a time during which the cultural foundations were set for the next stage in human history. And the High Middle Ages were when they really came into their own. Between the 10th and 15th centuries, you had the period of slow emergence and change, like trade, intellectual activity, then Gothic architecture, and there were extremely devout Christians with very strong participation and fervent spread of belief by missionaries. There's a change in the relationship between the West and other regions. Europe was originally at the mercy of invasions like Viking, constantly invade Western Europe. There was increasing participation in trade with Asia and Africa. There was sustained contact with the Byzantines and the Arabs through the Crusades, and finally they would learn about advances in math, science, and philosophy, and they would reabsorb that through this lens of theology that they had developed over this time period of just being encapsulated in this Christian worldview. And so that actually eventually led to the rise of the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and everything else that transpired afterwards, in which Europe would suddenly jump to the fore of human progress, or human expansion, or human violence, depending on which you want to emphasize. But Europe was very nervous about Islam in general, because they considered anything that was not Christian dogma to be a false religion. No wonder they would get rid of the effigies of ancient Greek and Roman statues and ancient Greek and Roman law, philosophy, technology, math, all of that development. They just got rid of it. And then they found it again in the Crusades. It's like a time capsule. What do you know? They tried a lot to copy Islam, the law, the science, the art. So they had this love-hate relationship going on. One-sided. The Islamic world didn't even care that they really existed. So two of the main developments in Europe that you have to know at this time period are manorialism and feudalism. What is manorialism? Manorialism is a system of economic organization between the landlords and the peasant laborers, aka the serfs, who live on estates, literally manors, which is why it's called manorialism. There were reciprocal obligations, so the serfs had to give their lord a portion of whatever they produced, and the lords in return protected these serfs and provided their everyday needs. The levels of production were low, technology was very limited, and everything was at the local level because there was no real involvement of the military because of this localized nature of manorialism. But what did manorialism do? Manorialism helped to create a system of local politics with regional aristocrats. And it was the most common form of political organization until the Vikings invaded in the 9th century, after which some more consolidation of power became necessary. The major weakness of manorialism was that there was isolation due to poor communication networks, monarchs, there was political instability, warfare, and lots of raids. And now for feudalism, the Vikings invaded in the 9th century. Now, for those of you who know, you know that Viking is actually a verb. The Vikings were not just one unified, cohesive unit. It just refers to the seafaring brigadiers who would maraud about and go Viking and invade and pillage. Western Europeans would turn to feudalism for greater protection eventually, but manorialism was not abandoned either as an economic system within small communities. They had a military and political system, and rulers provided protection and aid to the lesser lords, or the vassals, in Western Europe. So feudalism, in a way, was created almost as a system of defense against the Viking raids. Vassals would owe the rulers military service via knights, goods payments council, and they would sometimes receive land in exchange. The benefits were that this provided greater protection against raids because it was a system of military organization that could be more easily defended, and it provided political stability, no infighting, standing armies, and mainers would not be isolated anymore. So if you're just a bunch of isolated mainers scattered about in the countryside somewhere, then when the Vikings come, you're not going to be surviving very long. But if you're able to sort of cohesively come together into units of military and fight against the Vikings, you have a better chance of survival, and that's what's happening here. Now let's look at how feudal governments were eventually limited. The growth of feudal monarchies cut into the aristocratic power of the central powers that were being created at this time, and attempts were steadily made to limit monarchical power. In 1215, a major document that you need to know, the Magna Carta, English King John recognized the supremacy of the written law and was forced by his noblemen to adhere to it, and this granted basic rights to the noblemen. In 1265, you had the first English Parliament, which served as a check on royal authority. There was collaboration between the king and the aristocrats after that. In between the 11th and the 12th centuries, you have the three estates of the church, the nobles, and the commoners. And so you had legal rights according to the estates that you were born into. But despite all of this, the monarchs did continue to increase their power, parallel to how the feudal governments eventually grew as well. And larger conflicts, like the 100 Years' War, they led to early ideas of nationalism, with kings being leaders that embodied the country's principles. The Vikings, who had caused all of this, were mostly Danish, Norwegian, Swedish, but they didn't really divide themselves necessarily into subgroups of nationalities. They were just people that came together, a Viking, under a common lifestyle, a shared cause, goal, a system of faith, and a language. So there were largely raids from the 8th to the 11th centuries, and they caused feudal estates to form in Europe. They had lightweight boats with wide hulls that were very stable and easily handled in rough water. In the 10th century, they began to stop raiding. They began to convert to Christianity, and they started settling down around enclaves in Europe. And they continued to explore the northern Atlantic. They discovered Iceland, Greenland, North America, and so on. They were among the first European steps taken in the Americas in the Hudson Bay area. Now let's look at more developments in Europe at this time. This is Europe in 1300. You have the Sami tribes, the Siberian tribes, and the Finns at the top, but then you have Norway, Novgorod, Golden Horde, Hungary, Poland, the Holy Roman Empire, and then beneath that the Ilkhanate and the Berber tribes and the Arab tribes and the Mamluks. First, we're going to look at the Franks, the Carolinians, and Charlemagne. Again, if you're studying for Euro history, you're going to have a lot more of an in-depth look at these. But in 732, what happened? Charles Martel, the Frankish ruler, defeated the Muslims in the Battle of Tours, and he halted Muslim advances into the Western European area. Between 800 and 888, the Frankish Carolinian dynasty grew in power and became the origins of modern-day France and Germany. It was established by Charlemagne, who is Martel's grandson, and Charlemagne ruled for 14 years. The Pope's coronation of Charlemagne as the first Holy Roman Empire set the precedent that the Church's approval is absolutely necessary to legitimize Western political power. This comes in very, very important later on, and although this isn't really part of the time period that we're looking at necessarily, it is vital in understanding the context in which the Holy Roman Empire, which was a major player for a very long time in this area, came into its own. Now, the Holy Roman Empire, HRE for short, for the purposes of our class, emerged from one kingdom from the Treaty of Verdun in 843. So Germany and Italy became one, but its position fell into disuse after Charlemagne's kingdom collapsed and the entire empire kind of fell into decline. It was revived, however, in 962 when Otto I was crowned Holy Roman Emperor and merged classical claims and Christian claims. They proclaimed themselves a Christian continuation of ancient Rome. This provided a small amount of stability, but the power of the emperor was limited because he was a subsidiary to the pope, right? Everything was below the papal rule. And most of Germany still was run by feudal lords at this time, and most of Italy was sort of divided into city-states. It was difficult to enforce the Holy Roman Emperor's rule. Eventually, it was dissolved in 1806. During the Napoleonic Wars, but it held on for a very long time. When we look at the Crusades from the European point of view, we see that the Crusades had initial success, but ultimately ended with defeat. They passed through the Byzantine Empire, and they were sort of agog at the amazing architectural achievements. Eventually, they ended up succeeding in sacking Constantinople on the Fourth Crusade. There was new contact with Islam, and Western Europe's eyes were opened to new possibilities. The West wanted Eastern goods really badly, but they didn't really have anything to give in return. And so that was a point that they were starting to slowly think about changing and remedying. In the High Middle Ages, between the 11th and the 15th centuries, we had an emergence from the so-called Dark Ages, and there was increased urbanization, manorialism declined, social mobility increased, and trade with Asia steadily grew. There was increased economic activity in banking and universities. The first universities were created around this time. Feudal political structures declined, and centralized monarchies emerged. Nation-states were strengthened after, for example, the 100 Years' War, and then people found this newfound sense of patriotism, the sense of belonging to a country that had militaristic conquests and defenses and things like that. There was new technology developed for warfare. Now let's look at theology in terms of assimilating faith and reason. For example, in Thomas Aquinas' Summas, faith is primary, but reason leads to understanding. Therefore, you can reconcile Greek philosophy with Catholic theology. Because up to this point, it was just like, do we have to reject the pagan theology? What do we do? We found all these amazing intellectual achievements and all of this amazing tradition, and we've brought it back from the Crusades. We've brought it back from the Islamic world. What do we do with this? Do we have to burn it all over again? And this is where theology really started developing into a philosophy of its own that could eventually expand into the Enlightenment, where you would sort of synthesize these ideas that seemed antithetical to each other, but you could use this idea of faith, you could use this idea of scientific enlightenment, and rationality and faith did not have to collide with each other. And this embrace of that potential paradox resulted in the explosion of humanitarian and logical and philosophical literal enlightenment that would change and shape the course of humanity and human progress for years and decades and generations to come. And in a way, we're still living with that fallout. So scholasticism in the 13th century incorporated logic to resolve these theological problems, and the exploration of Greek philosophy and the assimilation into Catholic religious tradition led to a lot of debate in universities. This idea of combining rational philosophy, this newly rediscovered rational philosophy, with our heretofore rather dogmatic Christian faith. And so you had all of these different schools of thought, lively debate, and whenever there's lively debate, new exciting things happen, right? There was urbanization, growth of trade and banking, and the rise of guilds in the High Middle Ages. You had agricultural improvements, like the development of the mold board and crop rotation. Increased production led to population growth and increased size of urban areas. The peasants would gain financial freedom with these agricultural advances. Some became free farmers with no landlord, and eventually they moved to cities. Money replaced the barter system, and banking and insurance emerged as the Hanseatic League was created. It was a confederation of merchant guilds and cities in Northern Europe working together for economic mutual benefit. What is a guild? Guilds were organizations that group people in the same business or trade in a single city. You had merchants, weavers, woolmen, sculptors, artists, blacksmiths, and so on. They ensured standards, regulated apprenticeships, provided training and materials, and protected markets and set prices, and so on. What about the role of women? Well, the role of women, as in a lot of areas in the world around this time period, was divided into two. Women were either venerated and idealized, or debased and considered inferior. So the traditional roles that were prescribed to women were to be a wife, to be a childcare provider in this patriarchal society and system. But the code of chivalry that had developed throughout the Middle Ages reinforced ideas that women were weak and subordinate, but they also had to be like protected and stuff. The only alternative to marriage was to be a nun or to be branded a witch and burned at the stake. Women had no property rights, but women could trade, and women could and did belong to some craft guilds. There was a growing literature discussing women's roles as comforters to men, this idea of women as being or having to be docile, and that being the main virtue that a woman could have. However, the literature of this time, interestingly enough, shows us that this was not uniform across the board. For example, in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, you see depictions of women that are outgoing and lively and rowdy and sort of debauched, but kind of cool at the same time. Different people existed all across the board at different time periods, but we're just talking about major tendencies here. Marjorie Kemp, a female English Christian mystic, wrote the Book of Marjorie Kemp, and she chronicled her travels and pilgrimages across Europe and even to the Holy Land. She journeyed to Venice, Jaffa, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, the River Jordan, and Rome. She invented the memoir, this entire genre. Marjorie Kemp, she invented it. And she was a woman during the high medieval ages. You do have to know Marjorie Kemp. She's mentioned in the CDE. The spread of Black Death changed the face of Europe as we knew it then. After 1300, there was a lot of overpopulation, severe famine, warfare, and disease. In 1348, the bubonic plague arrived. It was also called the Black Death because you would have these giant black cantankerous lesions that would lead to death. This killed half of the entire European population. It was a result of greater connectivity and urbanization, but also, arguably, the accepted knowledge is that it was spread by the Mongols. Sometimes the Mongols used it tactically in warfare. We'll get to the Mongols in the next unit. The fleas and the mosquitoes and all of the things that traveled along the Silk Road. The church became increasingly rigid as reformers and mystics emerged. The idea was that there was no longer a need to go through the church to have a direct experience with God. There was a proto-Renaissance occurring at this time, intellectual and artistic life developing, and very realistic portrayals of space and nature. So we finished Unit 1, the Global Tapestry, comparisons in the period between 1200 and 1450 are, as outlined by the CED of the College Board. First of all, that you need to be able to explain the similarities and differences in the processes of state formation from 1200 to 1450. Unit 1 is very expansive, particularly so because after Unit 1, starting from Unit 2, it's just we're using these continuing actors and just keeping up to date with what's happening in each place and how they connect and their methods of connecting and how they interacted with each other and so on. But for Unit 1, it's like a total roll call of everyone that is present at this particular slice in time. And so it seems like there's a lot to remember. Everything is so vibrant, and above all, you have continuity, innovation, and diversity in all of these different regions. Now, remember that as the Abbasid Caliphate fragmented, you had new Islamic political entities emerging. Most of them were dominated by Turkic peoples, and these states demonstrated continuity, innovation, and diversity again. You had empires and states all over the world in Afro-Eurasia, the Americas, and in the 13th century, you had all of these countries. The Song dynasty particularly, you do need to remember that they utilized traditional methods of Confucianism and an imperial bureaucracy to maintain and justify its rule. Now we move on to Unit 2, Networks of Exchange. When we're looking at networks of exchange, we're looking at the Silk Roads, the Indian Ocean trade, the Trans-Saharan Desert trade primarily. When you're looking at Unit 2, we're looking at economic systems first and foremost, right? You have to explain the causes and the effects of the growth of these mainly three networks of exchange after 1200. So here we see the Silk Road. It's an ancient trade network. And the map above is a map that spans 300 BC to AD 100, the Silk Road. And then after 1200, we see the Silk Road trade is persisting for over 15,000 years and is only growing, which is a remarkable thing. We're going to see especially that the Mongols played a large part in the upkeep of these Silk Roads. Improved commercial practices led to increased volumes of trade, expanding the geographical range of existing trade routes, such as the Silk Roads, promoting the growth of trading cities that became increasingly powerful, and they were sometimes established anew, depending on where the trade route stretched. You had the growth of inter-regional trade in luxury goods being encouraged by innovations in previously existing transportation and commercial technologies, including the caravanserai, the forms of credit, and the development of money economies. You had a demand for luxury goods increasing in Afro-Eurasia, Chinese, Persian, and Indian artisans and merchants expanding their production of textiles and porcelains for export, the manufacture of iron and steel expanding in China, and so forth. Main illustrative examples that you need to remember according to the CED, trading cities Kashgar and Samarkand, and then new forms of credit and money economies, such as the widespread use of paper money, which eventually led to inflation in some areas of the world. We're going to get to that. Bills of exchange and banking houses being developed. Now let's really look at what it meant to be on the Silk Road. The Silk Roads were dangerous as tribal societies along the Silk Roads were drawn to its riches. A lot of tribes became skilled at raiding traders. So, I mean, it's like walking money, right? And if you're living out in the middle of nowhere, what are you going to do? You're going to raid traders. Chinese rulers protected trade and travelers on Silk Roads to the best of their abilities, but they couldn't be everywhere at the same time. Cities developed along the Silk Roads as trading posts and as rest stops for travelers. Common goods included from the Middle East dates, saffron, pistachio, rugs, and tapestries. From Africa, you had frankincense, aloe, gold, salt, and timber. From India, you had sandalwood, jasmine, cloth, and textiles. From China, you had silk, porcelain, paper, and tea. Steel and iron were always desirable because the higher the quality of the artisan, the higher the quality of the steel and the iron, and the rarer, the better. The transmission of art, language, and religion, such as Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, and even Greco-Roman knowledge, spread along these trade routes, and new forms of credit and money emerged, largely coming from China, right? Remember the flying money, the paper money, the bills of exchange, the banking houses that showed a demand for trade. You really got all of those in along the Silk Roads. This is an infographic that the National Geographic released about the caravanserai, where worlds and ideas connect. If you're interested in this, you can pause the screen and take a closer look because it is fascinating. When I see the word caravanserai, this is what I envision in my mind's eye. These major trade cities, the bustle and the smell of heat and sand and mud and livestock and spices and incense, and just the marketplaces and the jingle of the bells on the camels, and foreign languages from all over the world, all over the known world. This was a time when it cost an arm and a leg to even take a look at a map. Like, people didn't know about the outside world, but they also did. And these were the centers of the known world. It's so incredible, and it's romanticized, but for a reason, right? These major trade cities were called caravanserai. They were inns where caravans of traders could rest, and you had places like Kashgar, Samarkand, Aleppo, Mosul, and Merv. A lot of these cities are now under siege or unfortunately embroiled in civil wars. But these caravanserai became sites of cultural diffusion and exchange. These ancient cities. Crops were exchanged and goods were exchanged as well. For example, bananas traveled from South or Southeast Asia to Africa. Champa rice traveled from Southeast Asia to China and Japan. And then citrus went from Asia to Europe. Just all over the world, there was a lot of crop exchange as well as goods. Now for the Mongol Empire and the making of the modern world. This is a map of pre-Mongol Eurasia in 1200 CE. This is a map of how the Mongol Empire expanded afterwards, 1227 to 1290 CE. In that single, almost one generation and a half, you had the expansion of the Mongol Empire across the known world at that time. It's incredible. So look at that difference. The economic systems you're going to have to know. Explain how the expansion of empires influenced trade and communication over time. For example, the expansion of empires, including the Mongols, facilitating the Afro-Eurasian trade and communication as new people were drawn into their conquerors' economies and trade networks. The cultural developments and interactions explain the significance of the Mongol Empire in larger patterns of continuity and change. You had interregional contacts and conflicts between these states and empires, including the Mongols, encouraging significant technological and cultural transfers, a lot of cross-pollination taking place. Some of it not entirely of their own volition, and definitely none of this taking place peacefully. But we'll look briefly at Mongol society and what it was like to be a Mongol fighter before we get into the nitty-gritty. Illustrative examples you do need to know: technological and cultural transfers, transfer of Greco-Islamic medical knowledge to Western Europe, and the transfer of numbering systems to Europe, as well as the adoption of the Uyghur script by the Mongols. Mongol society was primarily a nomadic society, and they would migrate in search of grazing lands, and they drove herds of goats and sheep, and they would eat meat and milk from the herded animals. They would trade hides and dairy products for jewelry, weapons, and cloth. Mongol society was divided into tribes, and these tribes would combine during war when threatened, and then they would scatter, and then they would combine and scatter, and that was how it was for generations and generations. The Mongol fighters were accomplished horsemen. They were excellent with their short bows. Later, through contact with China, you had battering rams, cannons, the catapult, flaming arrows, and gunpowder. They would cover large distances very quickly because they're nomadic people and they live on the steppes. The steppes, meaning the flat highlands of Central Asia. And the Yam system was a system that used relay stations and messengers to carry urgent messages here and there, because on the steppes, on the plains, you have this wide, vast expanse of just grassland after grassland after grassland, where you graze your herds, you protect your herds, and if there are traitors, you're gonna raid them, so you need to be a good fighter, right? And the warrior code was bravery. You had to be brave or die. They would use a lot of spies and informants to create maps of areas they were going to invade ahead of time. They had a system for everything. Now let's look at Chinggis Khan. So Chinggis Khan is also called Genghis Khan. I mean, the orthography changes, but you gotta know who you're talking about. It's this guy, Chinggis Khan. His original name was Temujin, and he received the name of Chinggis or Genghis Khan later on after his exploits led to the creation of the greatest land empire in human history. It was certainly the largest in terms of the landmass and the area it covered, although culturally it didn't really leave that much of a mark compared to, for example, the ancient Romans. The landmass certainly was the most expansive in human history. So Chinggis Khan, or Genghis Khan, won the reputation of being an excellent warrior, military leader, motivator, and a visionary. So he, one-on-one, he had this amazing charisma. He would foster personal relationships with the leaders of all the different scattered tribes, and he would bring them together into one. He organized the Mongol tribes into a large confederation by breaking down the individual tribe loyalties, commanding his men along differently sized units that would contain each other. And so if a command was given from the top, it would travel way down. Loyalty was very highly prized and demanded. He recognized merit rather than any status or position that was incumbent within the tribes per se. And in 1206, what happened? Chinggis was elected Khagan, or Khan, the leader of the Mongol tribes, and so that's why he's Chinggis Khan. Kind of like Mansa Musa was Mansa Musa, because Mansa is the name of the leader. So let's look at the Mongol Empire of Chinggis Khan. He established his capital at Karakorum, and he brought scholars from all over his vast empire to Karakorum, and the Mongols were open to new ideas. They were very interested in Greco-Islamic medical knowledge, mathematics, and religion and philosophy in general. The Mongols helped preserve a lot of this Greco-Roman knowledge. The interesting thing about the Mongols, remember, they didn't really leave a mark on history compared to just how expansive and vast their land empire was. That was because they absorbed the cultures and traditions that they met. They didn't expound, or they didn't proselytize. They didn't have any of that. They would just enter, they would slaughter, or actually they wouldn't even slaughter directly. They would give you an ultimatum. They would say, are you ready to be part of my empire? If you're not, I'm going to kill you. If you say yes, then welcome aboard, and we're going to learn your language. We're going to be part of you, and you be part of us. A script was eventually devised for the Mongolian language called the Uyghur script. The Mongol conquests brought either bloodbaths or peace. There was no middle ground. Either everyone you knew would be butchered, or you would be able to have peaceful interactions with the rest of the world like you had never known before. It was very secure because the Mongols were the tippy top of the food chain. They would secure and monitor trade routes, the tax traders, and the items, but they were more interested in collecting tribute from territories than administering their empire, which is why it expanded so quickly and so widely, and then just as quickly, just suddenly died out. In 1226 CE, the Khan took an army of 180,000 people to complete the conquest of China and conquered Xixia. In 1227, Chinggis Khan died in battle, an honorable death for any warrior. Chinggis Khan's body was taken back to Karakorum for burial, and the remaining land was divided 4 ways between his 3 sons and grandson. His son Ogedai Khan became the Great Khan, and Ogedai directed troops for more conquests. After Chinggis Khan's death, the Mongol Empire was divided into 4 khanates: the Golden Horde, the Chagatai Empire, the Ilkhan Empire, and the Yuan Dynasty. The empire of Kublai Khan was the Yuan Dynasty, but as you can see, it was spread out across Eurasia. First, in Central Asia, you had the Chagatai Empire. It was led by the Chagatai Khan, the son of Chinggis Khan, and it was founded in 1225 and lasted until 1687, although it was already very weak by the 1360s when Tamerlane conquered the western half. It became increasingly decentralized into its subkhanates, and it sort of faded into obscurity eventually. Second, we have the Golden Horde ruling over Russia. Chinggis Khan's grandson Batu led the invasion of Russia, and it was the only successful winter invasion of Russia in history. Ferocious fighters, these people. The eventual goal was to conquer all of Europe, and it never really happened. Russia was divided into many little kingdoms, and they were unable to really fend against invaders. From 1237 to 1238 CE, Mongol forces invaded Russia, destroyed cities that resisted, and took a lot of Russian cities, including Kiev. The Golden Horde did not occupy or run the Russian government, and the tribute empire was formed, where Mongols forced princes to pay taxes and tribute. Moscow's role was to collect tribute. When the territories could not pay, the Moscow princes simply took over that territory. The result was a growth in strength of Moscow, and what happens with centralization? You have a government becoming more powerful, amassing power, and governance and administration becoming more and more effective. Moscow got stronger, the Golden Horde declined, and in 1380 CE, in the Battle of Kulikovo, the Russians defeated the Golden Horde. Now for the third, the Middle Eastern part of the Mongol Empire's subdivision, the Ilkhan Empire. Hulgu, the ruler of the Ilkhan Empire, captured Baghdad in 1258 CE and killed the Abbasid Caliph. The Mongols were defeated by the Mamluks of Egypt very soon after, so this halted the expansion of Mongols into North Africa, and Hulgu was forced to reconsider his plan to conquer the entire Muslim world. They really wanted to rule the world. Hulgu's cousin Berk, the new Khan of the Golden Horde, ended up converting to Islam, and so they used the local lords to administer taxes and take censuses. They were tolerant of scholars and artisans in general, and they assimilated to Middle Eastern outlooks, and some converted to Islam along the way. The Mongol Khans extracted taxes and tributes and really reinvigorated the Eurasian trade routes. Next, let's look at China's Yuan dynasty. The Mongols conquered the Xixia and Jin empires and turned toward the Song dynasty. Kublai Khan, the grandson of Chinggis Khan, led the forces against the Song beginning in 1235. In 1271, the Mongols ruled most of China. In 1279, they established the Yuan dynasty. They built the capital at Tatu, the present-day Beijing, and Kublai Khan passed a lot of laws to make distinctions between the Mongol and the Chinese. Chinese were forbidden to learn Mongol writing. Intermarriage between Mongols and Chinese was outlawed, and Mongol women were not practicing Chinese customs. They had a lot more freedom. Mongol women had always been much more free and equal compared to their counterparts at this time period. They don't adopt foot binding, and women can move about freely in public, and they don't adopt anything other than Chinese clothing and art. Now we're looking at Mongol role in Yuan China, as well as Marco Polo and the fall of Yuan China. During Yuan China, there was a lot of increase in the Eurasian trade along the Silk Road. You had merchants prospering and being valued, taxes being extracted from peasants. The Yuan court welcomed foreigners like Marco Polo and used the expertise of scholars from many regions. The Chinese civil service exam was not used at this time, something that drew wrath from a lot of Neo-Confucianists. Chinese were able to hold local or regional government positions. That was always the policy of the Mongols. They would respect the autonomy and the cultures of the places that they invaded. The Yuan developed a navy to expand to Japan. They were unsuccessful. Kublai Khan sought to reduce peasant tax and forced labor. They sought to establish elementary schools in villages. But, of course, the Song loyalists would revolt, and they grew stronger in the south. Mongol leaders lacked leadership, and they were plagued by corruption, because these were people that had lived the lives of warriors, and now they were stuck in these little civic roles, and it didn't really suit them. There was a lot of famine, there was a lot of peasant rebellion, there was a lot of rising tax for peasants and forced labor. The White Lotus Society was eventually formed, a secret religious sect that was dedicated to overthrowing the Yuan government, and in 1398 the Mongols retreated, escaping to Central Asia when they were overthrown by Zhu Yuanzhang, a peasant who founded the Ming dynasty. When we actually look back at the largest land empire in history, this lasted from the 13th to the 14th centuries, Pax Mongolica. Peace and stability, easy communication and commerce. They facilitated the Silk Road trade between Asia and Europe. So that was the Silk Road. Now let's look at the Indian Ocean and what kind of exchange took place here. When we look at the economic systems, we really want to look at how improved transportation technologies like the dhow with the lateen sail and developments in commercial practices led to an increased volume of trade, expanding the geographical range of existing trade routes, including the Indian Ocean, promoting the growth of powerful new trading cities. The growth of interregional trade in luxury goods was encouraged by significant innovations in previously existing transportation and commercial technologies, including the use of the compass, the astrolabe, and larger ship designs. The Indian Ocean Trading Network fostered the growth of states in different regions. In this picture, we see someone using an astrolabe. Isn't it amazing to think that someone painted this centuries ago and we're looking at it now? It's just incredible. It blows my mind every time. Now, this is a map of that entire area, and in key places along important trade routes, merchants set up diasporic communities where they introduced their own cultural traditions into the indigenous cultures, and indigenous cultures influenced merchant cultures. You had interregional contacts and conflicts between the states and empires, encouraging significant technological and cultural transfers, including during Chinese maritime activity that was led by Ming Admiral Zheng He. The expansion and the intensification of long-distance trade routes often depended on environmental knowledge. So this is another element where we look at the theme of humans and the environment. You had to have advanced knowledge of the monsoon winds. Remember, it was seasonal trade along or across the Indian Ocean. Illustrative examples, you have the growth of states like the city-states of the Swahili coast, the Gujarat and the Sultanate of Malacca, diasporic communities, Arab and Persian communities in East Africa, Chinese merchant communities in Southeast Asia, and Malay communities in the Indian Ocean basin. Remember what I told you about repeating things and where the spirals node up, right? Keep these in your memory. You have to remember these. Next, the 16th century agency trading network stretched from the Middle East and Africa to East Asia, and it was divided into three major zones. Count them, 3. The Arab zone involved glass, carpets, tapestries, horses, slaves, gold, ivory, forest products, and animal hides. The Indian zone incorporated cotton textiles, gems, elephants, salt, and cinnamon. The Chinese zone involved spices, silver, paper, porcelain, and silk. Nowadays, we just walk on down to the nearest convenience store and pick up a packet of any of these. Maybe not the elephants, maybe not the silk, but back then You had to travel for years and years to get your first taste of cinnamon, and just imagine what it would have been like to have your first taste of cinnamon after traveling for years trying to get it. Pretty incredible time. So now let's look at the illustrative examples of technologies encouraging intra-regional trade, such as the camel saddle and the caravan. The trans-Saharan trade routes, which mainly traded in salt and gold, remember, across the Saharan desert. They used camels, and even to this day they use camels, and there's a lot of salt to be harvested from the areas that were once deep ocean seabeds way before the tectonic plates shifted. You have camel saddles being developed, enabling easier trade, and then you have caravans. Remember, again, these are being repeated. This is where the spiraling nodes connect, right? So you got to remember these camel saddles and caravans. This is a map of the trans-Saharan trade route. Marrakesh, Tangier, Fez, Sijil Massa, and so on. You have these major cities, Tripoli, Tunis, and so on. The triangles are where you get salt, the squares are where you get the gold mines, and then the red is where the major trade routes connect, the circles, the major cities. And so whenever you see this sort of gridlock-ish pattern, kind of like some sort of mesh mask that has been put on the top of northern Africa, you're going to see, okay, this is the trans-Saharan trade route. Okay, so now let's look at technology and innovation along the trans-Saharan trade routes. The growth of inter-regional trade was encouraged by innovations in existing transportation technologies. Improved transportation technologies and commercial practices led to an increased volume of trade and expanded the geographical range of existing trade routes, including the Trans-Saharan Trade Network. In terms of governance, the expansion of empires, including Mali and West Africa, facilitated Afro-Eurasian trade and communication as new people were drawn in to the economies and the trade networks. In terms of cultural developments and interactions, there was a lot of increased cross-cultural interaction, resulting in the diffusion of literary, artistic, and cultural traditions, as well as scientific and technological innovations. Cities' fates varied greatly. There were periods of significant decline, periods of increased urbanization, and there was a lot of rising productivity and expanding trade networks as well. As the exchange networks intensified, there was an increasing number of travelers within Afro-Eurasia who wrote about their travels. Ibn Battuta, Marjorie Kemp, Marco Polo. You're going to want to remember. Ibn Battuta traveled the Islamic world, while Marco Polo traveled all the way to the Yuan court, and Marjorie Kemp, she traveled to the Holy Land, Jerusalem, right? She toured the Christian world. Now let's look at the environmental consequences of connectivity. Between humans and the environment, there was a lot of diffusion of crops and pathogens, epidemic diseases, including the bubonic trade along trade routes. Illustrative examples are the diffusion of crops, bananas in Africa, new rice varieties in East Asia, and the spread of citrus in the Mediterranean. All you have to do when you're writing your essay, just mention a couple of these, pop these up, and you're good to go. Now let's look at the comparison of these systems of economic exchange. We're doing a full review of Unit 2's key concepts. You see the deepening and the widening of networks of human interaction within and across regions that contribute to cultural, technological, and biological diffusion between these various societies. Improved commercial practices leading to an increased volume of trade and expanding the geographical range of existing trade routes, such as the Silk Roads, promoting the growth of powerful new trading cities. The growth of interregional trade in luxury goods was encouraged by innovations in previously existing transportation and commercial technologies, including the caravanserai that we see here pictured to the left, forms of credit, and the development of money economies. You have changes in trade networks resulting from and stimulating increasing productive capacity, with very important implications for social and gender structures and environmental processes. Demand for luxury goods increasing in Afro-Eurasia, and Chinese, Persian, and Indian artisans and merchants expanding their production of textiles and porcelains for export, as well as the manufacture of iron and steel expanding in China. Now we're on to Unit 3 of land-based empires. In terms of governance, imperial expansion relied on the increased use of gunpowder, canyons, and armed trade to establish large empires in both hemispheres. Land empires included the Manchu in Central and East Asia, the Mughal in South and Central Asia, the Ottoman in Southern Europe, the Middle East and North Africa, and the Safavids in the Middle East. Political and religious disputes led to rivalries and conflict between states. For illustrative examples, we have state rivalries such as the Safavid-Mughal conflict and, as mentioned way before, the Songhai Empire's conflict with Morocco. So, first, let's look at Ming China, which lasted between 1368 to 1644. The Ming Dynasty, as we saw earlier, was founded by Zhu Yuanzong, a military commander of peasant origins, and in 1368, he declared himself the Hongwu Emperor. He returned China to its Chinese imperial traditions and removed all of the Mongol influences. There was another scholar gentry revival. Remember that Yuan China, under Mongol rule, had abolished or gotten rid of the examinations, right? The scholar gentry system. For Hongwu, this was an essential part of Chinese civilization. The Confucian-based examination system was reinstated and made a lot more complex. Your exams took several days to complete, and everyone who passed was eligible to take more exams, and these exams were given every 3 years. Imagine retaking the AP test every 3 years. Oh my goodness, right? So test takers would compete for degrees, and then they would go on to positions in the bureaucracy. Women were still banned from taking the exam. Imperial academies and regional colleges were completely restored. But then the Europeans arrived, right? And then the policy of isolationism increased isolationism and increased Neo-Confucianism. Neo-Confucianism intensifies at this time, and in 1390 the first imperial edict was issued to limit Chinese overseas commerce. In 1433, at the end of Zheng He's expeditions and the navy started to decline, Europeans at this time were starting to look to expand, and they were thinking, oh good, is China being weakened? Can we sort of divvy it up and eat it up, and can we conquer it? In the 16th century, the Jesuit missionaries Matteo Ricci and Adam Shaw targeted the emperors and the chief advisors using scientific knowledge and technical skills to convert the elite. They did not really work, although they gained a few converts. In general, they were considered barbarians and threats and general weirdos because Christianity, a lot like Buddhism and Islam, is fundamentally an equalizing religion. Everyone is equal under God, the higher supreme divine power, and all that talk of some kind of divine power in the afterlife and stuff, that didn't really fly in the courts of this very pragmatic, very real world, very social hierarchy-based Neo-Confucian world, right? And so the Franciscans and the Dominicans tried to convert the masses. Again, it didn't really pan out. By the late 1500s, the Ming Dynasty was in bad decline. You had a lot of mediocre and incompetent rulers, inferior and corrupt bureaucrats, and public works projects failed miserably, causing a lot of starvation and rebellions, peasants being abused by landlords. All of that happened, but it ended in 1644 when the northern nomads, the Manchus, invaded. And the last Ming emperor, Chongzhen, hung himself. The leader of the Manchus, Nurhaci, established the Qing dynasty. In Qing China, between 1644 to 1912, you had Manchu nomads living north of the Great Wall overtaking the weakened Ming dynasty. Remember, at the onset, I mentioned that the history of China is generally this history of trying to keep the northern barbarians, quote-unquote, out, right? But again, the Manchu nomads quickly took over. The leader, Nurhaci, unified many of the Manchu tribes, and in 1644, the Manchu seized the capital of Beijing and took that dynastic name of Qing, which means blue. And the empire is often referred to as the Manchu dynasty. In English, the Qing were not part of the Han Chinese ethnicity that every other dynasty had been a part of. The relationships between the Manchus and the Han were complex, and sometimes the Manchus mandated that Han men have to shave their heads as an act of humiliation, and then the Manchus would respond by killing themselves or chopping off their own heads, because the idea was that because ancestor worship and Neo-Confucianism was so important, your hair was inherited from your parents, and so if you cut off your hair, it was like cutting off your lineage, your entire connection to your parents, which is why Buddhism had also been so reviled for such a long time, because, Buddhist monks shave their hair as a symbol goal of renouncing the material physical world and all of their connections to their secular families and their loves and all of that. And so the Han were very displeased with this new development of having to shave their heads. The Qing maintained a lot of the political social systems of the Ming, such as the traditional Chinese patriarchy, civil service exam, and an emphasis on agriculture, but there were some changes. There was a ban on foreign travel and trade that was lifted, and commercialization and urbanization exploded at this time. The Qing imperial portraits now we're going to take a closer look at. These are very significant in terms of art history. The Qing, aka the Manchus, faced the problem of ruling a group of people as foreigners. They were the minority, the Han were the majority. What were they going to do? And they were invaders as well. They needed to claim legitimacy, and there was this idea of the mandate of heaven that they thought could be very useful for them to use to legitimate their rule, because the mandate of heaven was actually very similar. We're going to take a much closer look at this Unit 4, but the mandate of heaven was essentially this idea very similar to the idea of divine right of kings, where the ruler would say that heaven or God or some kind of supreme power had ordained his rule, his leadership. Kind of also very similar to how the African kings would utilize, the African emperors would utilize the Islamic faith as a way to justify their rule as political tools. And so conversion was a matter of political expedience. And so for the Qing, this idea of the mandate of heaven, not so much a religion as a belief system. Confucian thought doesn't really give so much thought to the afterlife as to the immediate pragmatic practical relationships that you have in this world and how you relate to society. Maybe you commune with the spirits of your ancestors, but that's about it, right? And so the Qing used this, depicting their imperial portraits. Although these imperial portraits did exist before the Qing refined this genre. They took it and ran with it. Their claims to the Chinese throne, they wanted to connect themselves visually to the great Chinese emperors of the past that had that mandate of heaven. So they wanted to claim that mandate of heaven for themselves. They often had a lot of Manchu motifs drawn into the sumptuous silken clothing of the emperors, and this was used to enhance the legitimacy of these new emperors, of this new ruling class. Now, Japan at this time was constantly trying to expand, but it wasn't doing a very good job of it. By the 16th century, after a recurring civil war and the decline of the Ashikaga shogunate, Japan really needed to restore unity. And so in 1573, Nobunaga, who was a daimyo, ended the Ashikaga shogunate through extensive use of firearms. Now remember, up to this time, up to the 1500s, the mid-1500s, you had slow but steady increasing contact with the Western world, especially Portugal, between Japan and Portugal mostly. There was a lot of interest in Japanese copper on the part of Portugal, a lot of interest in Japanese pottery and so on. But all Japan really was interested in was the firearms, because by this time the Western world had really upped its game when it came to firearms. And so in 1580, Nobunaga unified much of central Honshu and drove armies against the Western daimyo. In 1582, he was killed before the completion of his conquest, and so Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the general of Nobunaga, continued Nobunaga's military campaign and ruled Japan by 1590. These people, ever since the Heian period, have been fighting amongst each other for a really long time in terms of feudalism, and it has been continuing. And so now that they have those Western firearms, they're jacked, they're ready to go. And so Hideyoshi was thinking, okay, I'm going to attack Korea, and then I'm going to attack the Qing, and then it's the world domination for me. But it didn't really work out. He attacked Korea in a series of wars called the Imjin Wars that lasted from 1592 to 1598. Didn't work out. He died in 1598, and the struggle for succession ensued. For a long time, for centuries to come, East Asia wouldn't really be expansionist after this. They would sort of seal themselves off in their little cocoons until Japan rose again. And so how was Japan's expansion somehow blocked. Well, the Korean Admiral Lee Sun-shin commanded a fleet of Korean soldiers and armored ships called the turtle ships, and you can't really burn down a ship that has battle armor on it, and so it was kind of like a navy tank. A very interesting invention. And the Japanese invasions of Korea at the time were the largest seaborne invasions in history until the Normandy landings of 1944. Over 300,000 men were committed to the campaigns. Imagine that being botched. So what does this signify? It signifies that Japan was ready and roaring and gearing up to go. It had ended its little tryst with feudalism, or so it thought. It was ready to expand too, but it just didn't really have the wherewithal, and after its defeats at the Imjin Wars, it just kind of shrunk into itself and didn't really even accept many missionaries for a long time until the Meiji reforms, which you're going to see in subsequent units. The Tokugawa shogunate was around this time, between 1603 and 1868. Tokugawa Ieyasu won the contest for succession after Hideyoshi's death. And so in 1603, the emperor appointed him the shogun. Ieyasu did not continue Hideyoshi's military campaigns outside of Japan, but he focused on consolidating power at home. He reorganized the remaining daimyos. Most of the land in central Honshu was now under the control of the Tokugawa family, rather than under daimyo control. He ruled from Edo, which is now Tokyo, and Tokugawa's victory put an end to civil wars and brought political unity and centralization to Japan, setting the stage for the next course of human history when Japan would suddenly become an empire. But Japan isolated itself for the most part at this time, focusing on internal affairs. European traders did begin visiting the islands in increasing numbers since 1943, when the Portuguese were shipwrecked on the Japanese coast, and there was a lot of trade that did happen. But when Roman Catholic missionaries tried to convert the Japanese to Roman Catholicism, the Tokugawas thought that Christianity was a threat to their authority, again because it's too equalizing, and that threatens the existing authority. So the Christian missionaries were ordered to leave. They were persecuted. A lot of them were killed, and so on. In the 13th century, the Mongol invasions destroyed Muslim unity. 3 new Muslim empires emerged, and there was the new growth of Islamic civilization: the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals. Keep in mind, the Ottomans are Sunni. The Safavids are Shia. The Mughals are Sunni. And so the Ottomans spanned from 1299 to 1923. The Safavids lasted from 1501 to 1736. The Mughals lasted from 1528 to 1857. Bear in mind, the College Board really likes their Ottomans. What are some similarities between the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals? They all originated from Turkish nomadic cultures. They had great military and political powers, as well as effective use of gunpowder. They had Islamic Renaissance, and they spread Islam to new territories with their religious zeal. They were ruled by absolute monarchs, and they taxed agrarian populations. What are the main differences? The Mughals ruled mostly non-Muslims, such as the Hindus in India. The Safavids ruled mostly Muslims, but they were the Shia. And then the Ottomans ruled a mixture of Sunni Muslims and Christians. So that's the basic difference. Now let's look at how the Ottoman Empire came to power. In 1243 CE, the Seljuk Turks fell to the Mongols. In 1258, all the way through to 1335, you had the Ilkhan Empire. In the 1350s, the Sunni Ottomans began building an empire based in Anatolia, Turkey, and it was named after Osman Bey, the leader. They rapidly expanded the territory into the Balkans and the surrounding area until 1453. Mehmet II led the Ottomans to conquer Constantinople with 100,000 soldiers, and this led to the collapse of the Byzantine Empire. Soon, the Ottomans extended their empire into Syria, Egypt, North Africa, Hungary, and the Black and Red Seas. They had a powerful army that built up firearms and canyons. They were a threat to Western Europe. In the 16th and 17th century, they lay sieges on Vienna and Austria. Now, when we look at the Ottoman military, they were notorious. They had janissaries, and they had a navy. The Ottoman navy was all-powerful up until the Battle of Lepanto. The Battle of Lepanto is one of those events in human history that really changed the course of everything and spelled that hinge upon which the trajectory of history just turned and swiveled on its axis. Let's look at what it was like for the Ottomans when they were focused on warfare, what the military was like. They were determined to create a class of warriors that were loyal to the Sultan only. And remember how the Mamluks were captured slaves, and the Janissaries were very similar. They were kind of inspired by that. They were captured, conscripted Christian boys. So they would kidnap Christian boys, convert them to Islam by giving them rigorous training and education, and they would make them be very loyal to the Sultan. They were essentially legal slaves that were highly educated and placed with Ottoman families to be converted to Islam. The selection process was called devshirme. The Janissaries controlled the artillery and the firearms. They were the most powerful component of the military, but ultimately, when you have a lot of power, what happens? You slowly become complacent, and then you block reforms, and when you block reforms, what happens? Your empire declines. The Janissaries were a very excellent example of how military service eventually translated into political influence at this time. The Ottomans had a lot of internal military problems that led them to slowly but steadily fall behind in improvements to the military. It was an old, mighty, ancient country. The Ottoman navy was all powerful in the Indian Ocean until the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. It signaled the end of Ottoman naval dominance, and they tried to rebuild the fleet a year after the battle, but the Portuguese naval victories in the Indian Ocean weakened Ottoman presence in the Indian Ocean trade, leading to that transfer of power to Western expansion. The Ottomans fell behind in technology after ignoring Western technological innovations. The Ottoman tax collection system is something that you definitely need to remember for the test. It was called tax farming, and so what they would do is the Ottoman government would auction off the responsibilities of collecting taxes to the highest bidder. The Ottomans would tax land, urban services, and most goods. The winner was called multazim, and the multazim would collect all the state taxes, and he was allowed to keep a portion for his own use. This began during the reign of Sultan Mehmed II until it was abolished in 1856 because there was too much corruption going on. Now, in terms of culture, the Ottomans had a rich, vibrant culture. Of course, they had access to Constantinople, the capital, and they restored that. Each sultan tried to really beautify the capital. Sultans and administrators built mansions, religious schools, hospitals, rest houses, and gardens. Hagia Sophia, which had been a Greek Orthodox church, was converted into a giant mosque. You had a commercial center with great bazaars, merchant and artisan classes, Turkish, then Persian, then Arabic. The language shifted, but Jews who had recently been expelled from Spain and Portugal were welcomed in the Ottoman Empire, and the Jews brought Greco-Roman knowledge from Islamic Spain with them. Why had Jews been expelled from Spain and Portugal? Because Ferdinand and Isabella were carrying out the Spanish Inquisition. They had a lot of overcompensating to do after all of that Islamic rule over the centuries, and they were chasing out any of the so-called heathens, any of the so-called infidels. Unfortunately, a lot of minorities, such as Jews and the Roma, suffered greatly under that kind of persecution. So now let's look at Ottoman society. Ottoman society was socially dominated by warrior aristocracies originating as Turkish horsemen. The Ottoman sultans would issue timars. Timars are what they called land grants as compensation for the military service, and this helped to reinforce an elite class of aristocrats. The Ottoman sultans promoted public works projects, the arts, and promoted trade, but Ottoman women faced a lot of legal and social disadvantages. You couldn't be educated, you couldn't participate in politics. Elite wives and concubines exerted influences over sultans, but a lot of women lived very sad lives. As a matter of fact, they were subordinate to their husbands and fathers. You couldn't even really leave the house without a man by your side, and a lot of women were restricted to the harems and concealed from outside eyes. The Ottoman Empire lasted for over 600 years, and during that time the Ottomans were able to fight off a lot of rivals. They survived for so long in large part because European rivalries among the different European countries distracted the Europeans. The Janissaries were conservative and traditional. They were able to resist and withstand the westernized reforms, but ultimately the empire was just too large and it couldn't last forever. The Ottomans were unable to expand against other Muslims and Christian groups. The effectiveness of the administration slowly diminished as the bureaucracy became more and more corrupt. Local officials squeezed peasants for taxes and services. Officials became corrupt. Peasant uprisings and abandonment of lands followed suit. Eventually, silver from Peru and Mexico led to inflation until civil strife increased. Now let's look at the Mughals in India. The Mughals were founded by Babur in 1528, and Babur traced his lineage back to Timur the Lame. They used gunpowder and military strategies to assert power over the rivals in northern India. They were more interested in territorial expansion and riches than the spreading of Islam per se. They were interested in art and war, but they were not very administratively good in terms of leadership. When Babur suddenly died in 1530, the successor is his son Humayun. There were a lot of invasions in this time of weakness, and when Humayun died in 1556, he left the empire to Akbar. And Akbar is also called Akbar the Great for a reason. Akbar ruled between the years of 1560 and 1605 after a period of invasions. Akbar had a vision for the empire and wanted to unite all of India. He extended the empire throughout the north and the central areas of India, and he began to eliminate the warrior aristocrats, also called the zamindars, from running villages in his newly established bureaucracy. So previously, the zamindars, the aristocrats, had collected tribute from peasants, and they were allowed to keep 10% of it themselves before they sent it to the government, and tribute could be paid in crops, rice, and pepper. This is a system ripe for manipulation. The zamindars actually kept a lot of the tribute for themselves, and the peasants and the royalty did resent them. What Akbar did was he monetized the system of taxation so that peasants were required to pay taxes in currency rather than produce, and they had to take their produce to state-monitored markets to sell produce for cash and then directly pay the government with that. Akbar also had a lot of social reforms carried out throughout the great land, and he encouraged widow remarriage and legally prohibited sati, discouraging child marriages, allowing for special market days as well. He encouraged good relationships and intermarriages between Muslims and Hindus. He respected Hindu customs. He utilized the Hindus in bureaucracy. He was a great patron of the arts, and he even invented a new faith, trying to overcome that divide between Islam and Hinduism. It only ever had like 9 converts. Din-e-Ilahi, it was the least successful religion in terms of how many adherents it had. But, I mean, it was a good effort. It was a good faith effort to try to create a faith that would unify his followers, right? Mughal India reached its peak at the end of Akbar's reign, and it was an overseas destination for traders because where there is peace, the business will follow. After Akbar died in 1605, Jahangir and Shah Jahan's reigns followed, and both retained that tolerance towards the Hindus. They kept allies, and they fought their wars against enemies. They were both great patrons of the arts. The arts flourished at this time during the Mughal Empire. They were famous for cotton textiles, and they had a very large market in Europe. They didn't really add a lot of territory, and the majority of the population was, in fact, very poor. They were in poverty, and India slowly fell behind Europe in innovations and sciences, focusing rather on the luxurious side of things, which always leads to corruption, poverty, decline, and the fall of a civilization. What key mistakes did the Mughal make? Jahangir and Shah Jahan left the administration to their subordinates, their wives, to control of the real decisions, and elsewhere women became more secluded. The reforms of Akbar eventually died out. Aurangzeb, who was Shah Jahan's son, came to power with 2 stupid goals. First, he wanted to extend Mughal control over all of India. Secondly, he wanted to purify Indian Islam and rid it of Hinduism. The Mughal-Maratha Wars eventually broke out that severely weakened the Mughals, and by the time of his death in 1707, Aurangzeb had conquered most of India, but in the process of doing so, he just drained the treasury, and there just wasn't any money left. He became involved in long wars, and he failed to complete administrative tasks and reforms. His religious policies weakened the internal alliances with Hindus that had been built up for so long. Some social progress that had been made was all abandoned and halted. And then what happened? Britain and France in the interim had been steadily growing in expansion and power. They became very interested in India as a colony. And then the central government declined as India returned to its dismantled local governments by the 18th century. Now let's look at the Shia Safavids. They rose from Turkic nomadic groups after the Mongol invasions, and they practiced Shia Islam. Sa'il al-Din, the Shiite Sufi mystic, began a militant campaign to purify and reform Islam, and he spread Shia Islam throughout the Turkish tribes of the region in Persia and Afghanistan. So in 1501, Ismail won the territory victories and was declared Shah, or emperor, of the Safavid Empire. In 1514, the Battle of Chaldiran broke out, and it was a conflict with the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottomans ended in victory. Shiism was blocked from further westward advancement. When we look at politics and culture under Abbas the Great, Abbas the First, in 1587 was when he started to rule, the empire reached the height of its strength and prosperity. They used youths that were captured in Russia, educated and converted to Islam in the army and the bureaucracy. There was a lot of controlled firearm use, and they received training from Europeans in their efforts against the Ottomans. Because remember, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and the Europeans did not like the Ottomans. Abbas I wanted the empire to be the center for international trade and Islamic culture, and he created a capital in Isfahan. Special building projects were created, such as elaborate palaces for shahs and mosques. In Safavid, culture originally used the Turkish language but switched to Persian after the Battle of Chaldiran. Remember, Persian had always been sort of the high language, the language of literature, the literature of high culture. So if you wanted that prestige point, you used Persian. The mullahs, which were educated in Islamic theology and law, were used as mosque officials, prayer leaders, and bureaucrats. And this indicated a move away from the more militant Shia ideology, and the bulk of Iranian population eventually was converted to Shiism in this process. When we look at how quickly the Safavid Empire fell, the Safavids reigned from 1501 to 1736, and the collapse was rapid and brutal. Abbas I, fearing assassinations, he removed all his suitable heirs, and a lot of weak grandsons followed, and this led to the decline and the imperial administration's collapse. In 1722, Isfahan fell to Afghani invaders. Nadir Khan Afshar from northern Persia declared himself Shah in 1736, but he was unable to restore any long-lasting authority. Let's look at the Mughal-Safavid War. Why did the Mughals and the Safavids fight amongst each other between the years 1649 to 1653? While the Mughals were at war with the group of Hindu Kush, the Safavids captured a number of strategic Mughal cities like Kandahar, and this led to Safavid victory. Why? The Mughal war with the Hindu Kush had already weakened the Mughal forces, and the terrain of that area is famously very hostile and difficult to traverse. The Mughals had a difficult time replenishing their lines, and so they fell. Now let's look at the Songhai Empire's conflict with Morocco between 1464 and 1591. Why is this relevant? Let's look at the Mughal-Safavid War and the Songhai Empire's conflict with Morocco. These were the two illustrative examples that the CED of the College Board specifically pointed out as things that you have to know regarding the conflicts of Unit 3, this time period in particular. And so what we realize are the commonalities between the Songhai Empire's conflict with Morocco and the Mughal-Safavid War is that these are wars of faiths. Right? These are wars that have to do with the clashes that occur between belief systems. Let's take a closer look at the Songhai Empire's conflict with Morocco in this context. The Songhai Empire achieved independence from Mali in the 1370s. They absorbed the Mali Empire entirely, prospering as a trading state and as a military power. Sunni Ali, the founder, was a great military leader, remember, and he presented himself as a Muslim but often practiced indigenous rituals himself. The rulers had practiced Islam, but the people had maintained polytheism. Remember. Now, the Muslims tend to be wealthy and they become elite. And what happened? The Moroccans launched a surprise attack in 1591. They believed that the Songhai practiced a lax form of Islam. Morocco wanted Songhai's trans-Saharan trade routes because remember, whoever controls the trade routes controls the power in that area, and Morocco wanted some of that sweet, sweet power. They already had firearms. Songhai had not yet modernized their army. What does that have to do with the Mughal-Safavid War? Now, we have to look at how faiths were utilized in politics, right? The rulers justified and legitimized their rules through the religions that they espoused or professed to espouse, or sometimes even created in the case of Akbar. And when these countries collide, their rulers are colliding, and so are their belief systems. And that's what we see embodied in the Mughal-Safavid War. That's what we see in the Songhai Empire's conflict with Morocco. Now, let's look at some more illustrative examples. Bureaucratic elites or military professionals, we can compare the Ottoman Devshirme and the salaried samurai of Japan. Very similar. You had that elite core that the ruler would go to maintain rule, and often they had all the weapons, they had all the technical mastery of the martial arts. They were able to subjugate people and be that threatening force behind the emperor in the off event that people happened to stray from following the hierarchical order. Next, let's look at religious ideas, the Mexican practice of human sacrifice, European notions of divine right, and the Songhai promotion of Islam. And these are major illustrative examples. The core takeaway that the College Board wants you to get from this particular unit is the idea that religions are used by those in power. Religions were used by governments to subjugate the people, to control the people, but also to legitimize their claim. So that's what we see here all across the board in all of these different civilizations. Next, when it comes to art and monumental architecture, remember the Qing imperial portraits and how the Qing tried to use that idea of the ancient Chinese idea of the mandate of heaven and try to incorporate themselves into that world view. And they would paint these imperial portraits, try to connect themselves to that lineage. The Incan Sun Temple of Cusco, remember, this was symbolic of how the conquistadors just decimated the indigenous faith of the Inca. And the Sun Temple of Inti was demolished in that way. The church, remember, of San Domingo was built over it. And so that use of crushing one faith with another, that was also a show of might on the part of the conquistadors, and we're going to see more of that consequently. The Mughals built a lot of mausolea, fancy mosques. Pictured here is the Taj Mahal, right? And then European palaces such as Versailles. All of these served to emphasize, legitimize, and centralize the governance. Who's in charge? The government is in charge. Whoever has taken over now is in charge. That was the purpose of this art and this monumental architecture. Remember, there were a lot of patrons of the arts among these rulers, and that's the reason why art moves the minds and the hearts of the people. And the rulers really wanted that. They wanted a piece of that, the hearts of the people. Why would it be important for them to win the hearts of the people? Because they were afraid. They were afraid that the ones they ruled over would rise up and overthrow them, right? There was always that fear, and that fear would come to prove itself not unfounded in our next few units. When we look at administration, you have the Mughal zamindar tax collection, Ottoman tax farming, Mexica tribute lists, and then you had the Ming practice of collecting taxes in hard currencies. So these are saisis or yuan baos, and essentially they were like the shape of gold and silver ingots. The Ming would collect taxes in the form of these ingots and precious materials, especially as a lot of silver and gold, a lot of these precious materials started coming over and flooding Eurasia after the conquistadors subjugated the entire continent of Latin America. Now let's look at how these belief systems really came into play. During the Protestant Reformation, what happened in 1517, we're hopping all over the map, but right now we're in Europe, right? So in 1517, a guy called Martin Luther posted 95 theses on the church door in Wittenberg, Germany in 1517, because he had had it up to here with how the Catholic Church was using indulgences. So the Catholic Church was making you pay so that you could get into heaven, and he didn't like that. He didn't like the Latin Bible. He didn't like the idea of celibacy for priests. He didn't like the idea of a pope. And so the pope said, I excommunicate you. And Luther was like, I don't care, because I believe that salvation is only obtained through faith in Christ. no matter how much I pay you, no matter how much I follow church practices, if I do not believe in Christ, if I am not saved, then there's no point in all of that. And so he viewed Christian participation in commerce favorably, and Luther's ideas spread rapidly via prints, because the Gutenberg print, remember, the Gutenberg print was able to finally churn out large volumes of printed material for the masses to read. And among those printed materials just happened to be the vulgarized version of the Bible that everyone could read and everyone could connect directly to God without mediation of a church or a priest. As a result of the Protestant Reformation, what happened? The spread of the belief that salvation can be achieved through faith alone took hold, and the creation of new Protestant churches just spread throughout Northern Europe and America. A lot of pilgrims escaped religious persecution to leave to the New World after it was discovered. I'm liberally using air quotes here. But so after the Protestant Reformation, there was a culture of questioning political and religious leadership, and this was so important, and also fostering in the Enlightenment, because you have to be able to criticize authority and question authority in order to overcome it or suggest reforms in as radical a manner as possible, whatever it takes to take humanity to progress to that next level. And so papal power decreased, the monarch's power increased, and the desire to read the Bible increased, which led to an increase in literacy. And eventually, the status of women increased, because what do we know about the religions of Buddhism, Islam at the beginning, and then Christianity and religions of that nature? They are equalizing, and they promote love and faith and trust and equality among everyone in every category. And so the promotion of love between husband and wife actually increased the status of women, because the actual content of the Bible, surprise, surprise, was actually not as misogynistic as the Catholic priests had said. So people were surprised by that as well. Although at this period in history is the qualifier that we need to apply to that particular fact. Anyway, the growing literacy and the spread of the printing press led to the spread of new religious ideas, and then the Second Protestant Reformation. This had its ramifications in terms of politics, and so the English Reformation, Henry VIII, the guy who killed all his exes, right? The Pope refused to annul his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon. So the Pope refused to annul Henry VIII's first marriage to Catherine of Aragon because she hadn't had a son, and Henry VIII was a misogynistic, ex-killing, femicidal maniac, and he really wanted a male heir, and so he just decided to get rid of the Pope. So with all of this going on, the Catholic Church couldn't just sit back and twiddle its thumbs. It launched the Counter-Reformation, or the Catholic Reformation. Catholicism was threatened by the sudden and extreme interest in Protestantism, and the Roman Catholic Church launched the Counter-Reformation, aka the Catholic Reformation. In the Council of Trent, the Church Assembly decided to abandon the sale of indulgences, and the goal was to make Europeans be incited with Catholic fervor and assert a personal relationship with Christ through the Church. There were a lot of new missionary efforts, and the Jesuits expanded their horizons to the Americas and Asia. Now, as a result of all of this, expansion occurred, and we're going to see that in the next unit as well, but the absolute monarchy also took hold at this time because of the Fronde. The Fronde civil wars in France from 1648 to 1653 paved the way for Louis XIV's expression of absolutism. Now remember, kids, XIV. No. X means 10 in Roman numerals, and when you have the I right on the left of the V, that means you subtract one I from the 5, which is the V, and so you got XIV meaning 14. Louis XIV's expression of absolutism just really took hold as a result of the Fronde civil wars, and here's why. The nobles revolted against the growing power of the royal government at that time, and Louis was just a child. Royalty were so fearful for their lives, and this made a large impression on Louis as he grew up. And when he grew up, he resolved he would not allow the nobles to revolt against the power of the royal government. He decided that he would proclamate this divine right of kings God had ordained for him to rule. And he had a strong, professionalized army. He had high taxes to support his wars, and he utilized a lot of bureaucracies. He reigned from 1638 to 1715, built the Palace of Versailles, and he actually made all the nobles come and live there. Famously, he said, "I am the state," or "I am the law. Le loi, c'est moi." That's what he said. He stopped convening the Estates Générales, the French parliament, and he passed his own laws. He sent the bureaucrats away to provinces. In England, what was going on? And why is it important, by the way, for us to know about what was happening in England and France at this time? Because these are going to lead to two of the three Atlantic revolutions. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, and then the Haitian Revolution. And those three revolutions are going to change the course of human history as we know it in Unit 5. That's why we're looking at this right now, for the contextual context. Okay, so what was happening in Britain? Britain was using a parliamentary monarchy. The king was sharing power with representatives selected by the nobility and the upper urban classes. In 1642, the English Civil War started, and it lasted until 1649. That was essentially the assertion of the parliament's power over the British monarch. And then you had the Glorious Revolution of 1689, in which the English King James II was overthrown. The significance of the parliamentary monarchy is that it instated the right of revolution. Monarchs should be restricted by institutions that protect the public. The power of the parliament is over the power of the king, and political groups can compete for influence. These were the main tenets that parliamentary monarchy instilled. Now, we're jumping back. We're jumping over and back and over and back again. We're jumping back to what the Shia-Sunni split and that particular collide in belief systems, what ramifications that has for the present day, right? 10 to 15% of the world's 1.6 billion Muslims are Shiites in this day and age, and they are a minority. Remember, the Shiites are a minority. They're concentrated in Iran, southern Iraq, and southern Lebanon, but there are significant Shiite communities in Saudi Arabia, Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. I'd really just encourage you to pull up a map and just look at it and visualize it and think, oh, okay, these are the areas where these empires were. These are the areas where the Sunni and the Shiite are today. And this split can be traced back to when the political rivalries between the Ottoman and the Safavid empires really just intensified and then split within Islam between the Sunni and the Shia. Now let's look at Sikhism, because the CED says we should, but also because it's super interesting. The rise of new sects like Sikhism, you have to pronounce it very carefully, sects, like Sikhism, tried to bridge the difference between the Hindus and the Muslims. It was a new religion that emerged in India. Again, we have that syncretism principle in play. Sikh means disciple, and it was founded by Guru Nanak, pictured down here. It was an example of religious syncretism at its finest. It combined Islam's notion of the oneness of God with the Hindu concept of inclusiveness. And so the Sikhs believed in reincarnation, the fact that the soul needs to be reunited or united with God, the lifestyle of moderation, right? Sikhs were perceived by Mughals as a perverted version of Islam and were seen as anti-Muslim threats. And so in terms of the cultural developments and interactions, we have the Protestant Reformation, political rivalries, and the split between the Sunni and the Shia, and Sikhism that you need to remember for this time period. Finally, let's look at comparison in land-based empires. I think that's what we've been doing this whole time, but still, let's look at how the College Board mandates us to do this. The learning objective is to compare the methods by which various empires increased their influence from 1450 to 1750. Let's look at the key concepts of Unit 3 in this review. The interconnection of the eastern and western hemispheres made possible by transoceanic voyaging transformed trade and had a significant social impact on the world. In some cases, the increase and intensification of interactions between newly connected hemispheres expanded the reach and furthered the development of existing religions and contributed to religious conflicts and the development of syncretic belief systems and practices. These empires achieved increased scope and influence around the world, shaping and being shaped by the diverse populations they incorporated. Imperial expansion relied on the increased use of gunpowder, cannons, and armed trade to establish large empires in both hemispheres. Land empires included the Manchu in Central and East Asia, Mughal in South and Central Asia, Ottoman in Southern Europe, the Middle East and North Africa, and the Safavids in the Middle East. Political and religious disputes led to rivalries and conflict between states. Now let's look at Unit 4, Transoceanic Interconnections. In terms of technology and innovation between 1450 and 1750, what transpired? Look at these, the caravel, the flute, and the carrack. These amazing ships were built at this time. Knowledge, scientific learning, and technology from the classical, Islamic, and Asian worlds spread and facilitated European technological developments and innovation. These developments included the production of new tools, innovations in ship design, and an improved understanding of regional wind and currents patterns, all of which made transoceanic travel and trade possible. Illustrative examples are innovations in ship design as shown in these photos, European technological developments that incorporated and were influenced by the cross-cultural interactions with the classical Islamic and Asian worlds, such as the lateen sail, the compass, and astronomical charts. Finally, our backwater Western European population has gotten the hang of how to use a compass, and they're going to change the shape of the world as we know it. When we look at the rise of the West, this is an era of great change. How the College Board would have you remember it is that in terms of governance, you had a lot of new state-supported transoceanic maritime exploration occurring in this period, and in terms of economic states, you had the Portuguese development of maritime technology and navigational skills, leading to increased travel to and trade with Africa and Asia, resulting in the construction of a global trading post empire, also leading to a lot of exploitation and murder and genocide along the way, as well as a huge migration of populations. The Spanish sponsorship of the voyages of Columbus and the subsequent voyages across the Atlantic and Pacific dramatically increased European interest in transoceanic travel and trade. Northern Atlantic crossings were undertaken under English, French, and Dutch sponsorship, often with the goal of finding alternative sailing routes to Asia. So when we look at the rise of the West, there were profound changes that moved history from the end of the post-classical period, which you've been looking at so far, to the early modern period, and Europe eventually comes out as top dog. Italy, Spain, and Portugal took the lead, but did not immediately displace the Arabs or the Chinese as international leaders. The Mongol declined, first in China, then elsewhere, turning trading attention to the sea trade, as Asian trade routes were disrupted in terms of goods, technology, and ideas. The Arabs were disrupted by the Mongol invasion of 1258, and then there was a lot of chaos between then and the founding of the Ottomans in 1453, and during this time, the focus was, everyone was internally focused on political stability and instead of ocean exploration, and so it was literally like a blue ocean for the Europeans to just jump right in. Medieval institutions declined, the knights declined, the power of the church declined, and remember, especially after the Black Death, people died. When a substantial portion of your population suddenly dies, there's this renewed realization of the sanctity of human life, right? And there's this revival of humanism. You were praying to God and God did not save you. You were in a family of 10, now you're the only one alive. And so you renounce your faith, you lose your religion, you come to appreciate the moment, but also you got a lot of resources left over. There was this sudden churning and yearning and this newly invigorated cultural expansion that sort of coincided with the Renaissance, coincided with this political expansion effort that was undertaken by Western Europe, right? At the same time, the major dominant powers had sort of quieted down, and so Europe actually didn't have any contenders. It was all on its own, and it launched itself right out there. Feudalism had been strengthened, and after the 100 Years' War, you had nationalism cropping up in different countries, such as France and England. a nascent sort of capitalism, not quite in its full-fledged form, not anywhere near the scale and scope of what capitalism would reach in the industrial era, but something similar to that, something like a small seed, a root, a nascent capitalism began to emerge. There was an interest in trade, and the Silk Roads had provided increasing access to Asian knowledge and technology already. The West had become used to Asian luxury goods, but they didn't really have anything to offer, right? They wanted all that cinnamon. Remember, you would travel for years just to get a taste of that cinnamon, and you were hooked. You wanted more. You wanted trade, but you didn't have anything to give for it. You were like a junkie. You wanted that cinnamon. You wanted that nutmeg. You wanted that silk, sugar, perfume. You wanted those jewels, but you only had wool, tin, copper, honey, and salt. And so they had to make up for this in gold. By 1400, there was a gold famine that threatened to collapse the European economy. And so they set out in search of that gold, for that El Dorado. And they sure did find it. What happened in the Renaissance when the rise of secularism took place? In 1400, the Renaissance, the Renaissance, quite literally the rebirth and revival of styles from classical Greece and Rome. For world history, just remember why it happened in Italy. The medieval forms and feudalism had never really permanently taken hold in Italy, and they had more contact with Greek and Roman tradition than the rest of Europe, certainly. And so they were also leaders in banking and trading, because remember, they were just sort of scattered out into these city-states, and the Renaissance really began in Florence. Religious art remained dominant, but they used realistic portrayals of people and nature. Non-religious subjects emerged. There was humanism developing, an interest in individuality and the capacity of the human mind and the human spirit. And you had artists and writers like Petrarch and Giotto, and architecture at classicism. This spurred innovation, exploration, conquest, and confidence. It was high culture. It wasn't popular culture yet, right? And so when we look at early attempts at Western expansion, in 1291 CE, Vivaldi sailed through the Strait of Gibraltar seeking Western routes to the Indies. In 1498, Portuguese Vasco da Gama reached India. Henry the Navigator sponsored Portuguese voyages, and the goals were scientific curiosity, to spread Christianity, and financial interest. He set up colonies designed to produce cash crops such as sugar, tobacco, and cotton, and the Azores Islands, the Madeira Islands, and the Canary Islands were discovered, or posts were created there, and there was a lot of interest in slave labor from Northwest Africa. So now let's look at what it was like on the Iberian Peninsula, which is where Spain and Portugal are. On the Iberian Peninsula, you had some contested territory between Christians and Muslims. Remember the Cordoba Caliphate of old? Well, the Christian military leaders had been pushing back against the Muslims for centuries, and after 1400, the regional monarchies of Castile and Aragon were established, and eventually they were united in 1469 when Ferdinand and Isabella, shown here, got married. It was a political marriage of expediency more than anything else. There was a rigorous military and religious agenda to promote Christianity by converting or expelling Arabs and Jews and expand Christian territory. Remember how a lot of these Jewish people ended up being accepted by the Ottoman Empire. That difference is also something you need to know about how people treated minorities depending on different empires and different faith systems at the time. Now let's look at Portugal leading in navigation at this time. They focused on discovery, destruction to the Muslim world, and wealth. Henry the Navigator organized expeditions along the coast of Africa. In 1498, Vasco da Gama reached India and sailed around the Cape of Good Hope. Da Gama's success led to other expeditions to Brazil, Mozambique, Indonesia, and Japan. Portugal claimed parts of the African coast and parts of Brazil and India. Now, what about Spain? Spain was full of religious zeal and a desire for riches. In 1492, this man, Christopher Columbus, reached the Americas, but he thought he was in India, which is why to this day, Native Americans sometimes are called Indians. Between 1519 to 1521, Ferdinand Magellan sailed around the world. Spain claimed Mexico, parts of South America, Florida, and the Philippines, and ended up importing a lot of silver from America. When we look at the chronology of the conquest, The periods of Spanish and Portuguese conquest and colonization can be divided into three, roughly. The first wave is the wave of human destruction, annihilation of cultures and civilizations, entire populations wiped out between 1492 and 1570. But then the second wave, between 1570 to 1700, consisted of minor alterations, so colonial institutions and societies became more definite. And in the third wave, we have the 1700s, where we see a lot of reform, we see a lot of revolts. In 1492, right, the Reconquista, the Spanish Inquisition. Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile carried out this program of religious unification in Spain, and they used Columbus and his voyages westward to expand Christianity. What about the conquistadors? 1/5 of all the treasure that the conquistadors would win went to the crown. Few of them were actually professional soldiers. They saw themselves as a new nobility to lord over the indigenous people, and lord over them they certainly did. They had firearms, horses, and steel weapons that gave them an advantage. Bureaucrats, merchants, and colonists soon replaced these conquerors around 1570. So let's look at Spanish conquest and what that entailed in South America. In 1509, Vasco de Balboa established a colony in Panama in search of gold. In 1535, Francisco Pizarro conquered the Incan Empire with 200 men. The Spanish replaced the Incan capital Cusco with Lima, and in 1540, Francisco de Coronado searched for 7 cities of gold in southwestern United States as far as Kansas. In the southwest of the United States as far as Kansas. And by 1570, 192 Spanish cities were established throughout the Americas. When we look at Hernán Cortés and Mexico, Hernán Cortés arrived in Mexico in 1519, and he led 600 men to Mexico with Spanish weaponry. They reached Tenochtitlan and captured and killed Moctezuma II. He was aided by Indian allies, people who had been conquered by Aztecs and did not like the Aztecs. And remember, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And then Malinche, Doña Marina, who acted as an interpreter. In 1521, Tenochtitlan burned to the ground and Mexico City was constructed. Most of central Mexico became New Spain. When we're looking at the Columbian Exchange, right, this is a major theme within humans and the environment. You have illustrative examples of domesticated animals such as horses, pigs, and cattle crossing the Atlantic and entering the Americas. Foods brought by African enslaved persons, of whom there were a great many, far too many. Okra and rice were carried over to the Americas. The new connections between the eastern and western hemispheres resulted in the exchange of new plants, animals, and diseases, known as the Columbian Exchange. European colonization of the Americas led to the unintentional transfer of disease vectors, including mosquitoes and rats, and the spread of diseases that were endemic in the Eastern Hemisphere, including smallpox, measles, and malaria. Some of these diseases substantially reduced the indigenous populations, with catastrophic effects in many areas. American foods became staple crops in various parts of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Cash crops were grown primarily on plantations with coerced labor, and they were exported mostly to Europe and the Middle East. Afro-Eurasian fruit trees, grains, sugars, and domesticated animals were brought by Europeans to the Americas, while other foods were brought by African enslaved persons. Populations in Afro-Eurasia benefited nutritionally from the increased diversity of American food crops. Now, mosquitoes and rats spread diseases very, very quickly. Smallpox and measles caused between 50 to 80% indigenous populations to die. Remember, a lot of them had mostly oral traditions, and so a lot of their histories are lost to time. When the people died, their histories died as well. Entire island populations were wiped out. Native Americans had just not been exposed to these diseases, and they had no natural immunities. And so, with all of these people dead, the Europeans had room, quote unquote, to create new populations with their own citizens and the African slaves that they had forcibly imported from other parts of the world. European guns, horses, and iron offered advantages where political chaos and population losses had occurred. Spain colonized the Americas first, in Hispaniola, in Cuba, and Jamaica, and Puerto Rico. In 1509 CE, Vasco de Balboa established a colony in Panama in search of gold. In 1528 CE, Francisco Pizarro attacked the divided Incan Empire and founded Lima. Early colonies were loose colonial administrations led by gold-hungry Europeans. They became more formal administrations eventually, as agricultural settlements were established under bureaucrats who arrived from Europe. When we look at the destruction of Amerindian societies, intentional or otherwise, it was nearly total. On the left is a chart comparing the native population to the population of livestock. The population of livestock is reddish orange, and the population of the natives is blue. And so we see, starting from 1550, steady decline of the Indian population until there's almost none left, and then steady increase of the European livestock. And so effectively, the people of the Americas were replaced by the animals of the so-called Old World. And to the right is also a chart depicting how the Indian population was essentially wiped out, and the European population was steadily brought in to supplant them. As time went on, of course, life is going to go on, and even though entire segments of the population were irreversibly destroyed, life went on, right? And so you had a lot of Europeans arriving in the Americas. But remember that the conquistadors, they were mostly male. They were mostly very aggressive. They didn't exactly bring their families along with them, but they were young men. And when they liked this new world, they wanted to settle there, and then they would meet somebody, or they would sexually exploit them, and then they would get married, or they would sexually assault them. At any rate, I don't know, this part is so depressing. So eventually, over time, life goes on, people mix and mingle, and, you know, there's always going to be the total annihilation of cultures is not exactly something that can be, I don't know, it's very sad. Anyway, you had this very rigid sociedad de castas. So you had a caste system within society. You had slaves at the very bottom. You had free Africans above that, and then above that, the Zambos, who were mixed. The Indians above that, or the indigenous peoples. Above that, the mulattoes. Above that, the mestizos, who were progressively more and more mixed. And then above that, you had the Creoles, the Europeans, and then the Peninsulares Europeans, right? The Europeans that were born in the Americas and the Europeans who were born in Europe even were segregated amongst each other. It was a crazy time. Let's continue to look at how these maritime empires were established in the Americas. First of all, you had chattel slavery. Enslaved people, mostly Africans and their descendants, were owned by other individuals in the form of personal property, and they would work without compensation, and this condition would last for their lifetime. It was an inherited condition. The things that people used to do to each other. Indentured servitude was a contract between two individuals where one would work for the other without pay for a fixed amount of time. The laborer would work for another benefit, such as passage to America, and debts owed were all too common. The things people do to each other. The encomienda system consisted of grants from the Spanish crown, which gave natives to the Europeans, and then the Europeans were responsible for the natives. Of course, this sounds terrible, and it is terrible, and it was terrible, and so they had to justify it somehow. What was the justification? Oh, you will kill the man, but save his soul, right? You had to Christianize them, and you could use them as forced labor. You had to be the missionary, and this is a recurring theme that we see in Christian missionary in whenever Christian missionaries encounter natives, break the man, kill the man, but save his soul. Like, for example, in the Belgian Congo, right? And then we have the Mita system. This was particular to Peru and the Inca. It was mandatory forced labor for Spanish profit with very small salaries, usually in the silver mines. This was appropriated from the Mita system that had traditionally been used by the Inca. But it was very different. It was a very, very different application of something that just had a similar name, right? And working in the mines was perilous, and conditions were not good, Many, many people died without seeing a single cent for their work. When we look a little bit closer at the economic structure of the Spanish colonies, the vision for the encomienda system was that Spanish landowners would protect and provide for natives on their land and convert natives to Christianity, while natives would work for Spanish landowners and learn about Christianity and benefit from Spanish protection. In reality, the encomienda system resulted in Spanish landowners exploiting and brutalizing natives, spreading diseases, stealing land, and making working conditions generally awful. Natives died in large numbers from exhaustion, injury, disease, and so on. Those who did not die were often too sick to work, and then they were punished until they died, right? And, of course, there was a lot of silver produced in New Spain, and then there was gold produced in Brazil. In terms of governance, so Europeans established new trading posts in Africa and Asia, providing profitable for the rulers and the merchants involved in new global trade networks. Some Asian states sought to limit the destructive economic and cultural effects of European-dominated long-distance trade by adopting restrictive or isolationist trade policies. Think Korea, think Japan, think China at this time. Driven largely by political, religious, and economic rivalries, European states established new maritime empires, including the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the French, and the British. This expansion of maritime trading networks fostered the growth of states in Africa, including the Asante and the Kingdom of the Congo, whose participation in trading networks led to an increase in their influence. So let's look a little bit closer at Brazil, which was the first plantation colony. In 1500, Pedro Cabral found, air quotes, Brazil on his way to India, and in 1532, Portugal officially settled Brazil. Sugar plantations using Indian labor set up on the Brazilian coast. And these sugar plantations required tremendous amounts of labor, and slaves arrived from Africa to support the plantations. By 1700, Brazil had 150,000 slaves. Half of Brazil's total population was made up of slaves. 7,000 slaves were imported a year. In 1549, Jesuit missionaries arrived, and in 1695, gold was found in Minas Gerais. So when we continue to look at these maritime empires being established, we see a general expansionist trend. In the 16th century, Northern Europe, France, England, and Holland became interested in exploration, and they mostly went northward in the New World, while British colonizers set up colonies in North America and India. The British set up colonies in North America and India. They tried to find an Arctic route to the east, but, the Arctic Sea is all frozen up. It isn't exactly conducive to traveling. The Dutch set up colonies in the Southeast Asian islands, Sri Lanka, and South Africa. The French set up colonies in the Midwestern and Southern U.S. via Mississippi and Canada. The Dutch-British East India companies were joint stock and trade companies that allowed risk to be distributed amongst a large amount of investors, and they amassed enormous fortunes. In the 1700s, the Indian Mughal Empire, after its decline, began to fall apart. The British and French East India companies increased their roles in international trade and administration. The British and the French struggled to control India, but the British eventually took over as colonists after defeating the French in several battles. Eastern Europe was included in the world economy at this time after a growing market for grain. Prussia, Poland, and Russia rose to power, and they had systems of landlords and serfs. When we look closer at British and French North America at this time, the English colonies along the Atlantic received religious refugees, mostly Calvinists, and France developed New France in Canada with 55,000 settlers by 1755, supported by the Catholic Church. In the 7 Years' War that spanned 1756 to 1763, Britain and France fought in Europe and America over the colonies. North American native groups pushed westward because of the colonists, and the colonists did not combine with the natives, unlike in Latin America. By the 1700s, 23% of the population of southern colonies were of African origin. When it comes to African coastal trading, we see that Europeans set up small ports, and they sold Asian and European items for slaves in Africa. They would negotiate with West African kings and merchants. Generally, they did not go inland because of the disease, the climate, and the geography, but the first exception was the Cape Colony of the Dutch at the Cape of Good Hope in 1652. This was a coastal station to supply ships bound for Asia, and the Boers, the Dutch farmers, populated the region. The second exception was when the Portuguese launched expeditions into Angola for slaves. Let's look closer at the economic systems. Despite some disruption and restructuring due to the arrival of the Portuguese, Spanish, and Dutch merchants, existing trade networks in the Indian Ocean generally continued to flourish and included intra-Asian trade as well as Asian merchants. There were newly developed colonial economies in the Americas, largely depending on agriculture, utilizing existing labor systems such as the Incan Mita, and introducing new labor systems including chattel slavery, indentured servitude, and encomienda and hacienda systems. Let's look at the slave trade now. In terms of social interactions and organization, enslavement in Africa continued in its traditional forms, including incorporation of enslaved persons into households and the export of enslaved persons to the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean regions. Oh, that's what the CED wants us to remember. The growth of the plantation economy increased the demand for enslaved labor in the Americas, leading to significant demographic, social, and cultural changes. The Trans-Saharan, Red Sea, and East African trade routes had been trading slaves for centuries throughout the Middle East and Northern Africa, but most of them were women. So the really important difference is that these women were usually traded as concubines for harems or domestic servants. Men were usually soldiers or field workers for salt production, gold mines, and caravan laborers. But the Europeans tapped into existing routes and supplies of slaves, and mostly started importing men, male slaves, to the New World, quote unquote. In the mid-1400s, Europeans began to utilize slaves in Europe as household servants, and other forms of servitude were used by Europeans. Impressment, indentured servitude, these were methods that were used by the Europeans. But in 1502, the first African slaves to the Americas really began being sent over, and slave trade became increasingly important because plantations, especially for sugar and tobacco, demanded constant labor. By 1600, the slave trade predominated over all other kinds of commerce on the African coast. Portugal controlled most of African coastal slave trade until 1637, which was when the Dutch seized Elmina in 1637, and so the Portuguese no longer monopolized slave trade after that. By the 17th century, the Dutch, the English, and the French competed with the Portuguese over the slave trade, and the trans-Saharan slave routes continued during this period. Atlantic slaves were mostly men, and they were used for plantation labor mostly. Sugar plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean were their main destinations, as well as cotton and tobacco fields in British North America. Slaves were usually prisoners of war or captives from African slave raids against neighboring African kingdoms or villages. African rulers generally didn't enslave their own people, but they would enslave neighboring peoples. Once the Europeans traded for Africans, slaves were forced to march to trading towns, and they were separated from their families, and the system of racism really began, in which your skin color became the mode by which your status was marked. And 25 to 33% of the slaves that were forced to march to trading towns died making that journey. Initially, the slaves were taken mostly from the Senegambian region, but later they were taken primarily from West Central Africa. Simultaneously, over 3 million slaves were taken by Muslim traders for the Trans-Saharan trade. When we look at American slave societies, saltwater slaves, which is what the African-born slaves were called, and then Creole slaves is what the American-born descendants of African slaves were called. Some were mulattoes as a result of the sexual exploitation of slave women. Slave women were raped more often than not. And the hierarchy of slaves was created by the slave owners. The Creoles and the mulattoes were given more opportunities to acquire skilled jobs, such as household servants. Family formation was difficult for slaves. Families could be separated at any time for reasons completely unrelated to their family dynamic. Cultural syncretism was common, and often Christianity and African religions and Islam were kind of fused together. This led to the African diaspora, the African slave trade between 1500 to 1870, as you can see. This is a map of the African slave trade between 1500 to 1870. So you can take a closer look at that and just envision the number of people that were forcibly moved from their homes to provide exploited labor on the plantations of these foreign lands. Okay, the Middle Passage was brutal between 1502 and 1850. 12 million Africans were shipped across the Atlantic. The mortality rate on slave ships, pictured here, a cross section, the mortality rate was around 15 to 20. So you had less than a 50% chance of survival if you were caught and traded as a slave. Either you died on the march to the ship, or you died on the ship. By some miracle, if you managed to arrive at your destination, you could be beaten to death, or worked to death, or raped to death. That was life as a slave back in the day. Things people do to each other, huh? Cargo sizes varied. Sometimes you would have as many as 800 slaves in one ship. And when supplies ran low, the weakest slaves were thrown overboard. It was incredibly traumatic is an understatement. You were just shackled, as depicted here. Africans were taken, enslaved, branded by hot irons, shackled, abused throughout the journey, and slave ships were dirty and unsanitary. You would suffer from poor hygiene, dysentery, disease, extreme anxiety, and illness. There was a lot of suicide, and there were a lot of attempts at resistance. So this capture and sale of human beings, of enslaved Africans, formed just one leg in a triangular trade of raw materials, manufactured goods, and enslaved Africans. The triangular trade made emerging capitalism central to the Atlantic world. It also made it global. European manufactured goods, especially guns, wool, and linen, were traded to the Africans for slaves, and these slaves were transported from Africa to the Americas through the Middle Passage. The slaves produced sugar, tobacco, molasses, rum, and these goods were traded to Europe. The Royal African Company was established. The English wanted their own source of slaves for growing plantations in Caribbean colonies, and they established trade forts in Africa to obtain slaves. What were the effects of the slave trade on Africa? There were endless wars between African kingdoms and tribes, promoting the importance of weaponry, because either you caught slaves or you became a slave. There was no middle ground, and so the sale of captive Africans was a way to obtain European gunnery. The most powerful African communities quickly became those who were willing to trade slaves with Europeans, and they obtained in exchange for the slaves firearms, iron, horses, cloth, and tobacco. As a result, you had something called the gun and slave cycle, where you had guns and slaves exchanged over and over again. You needed guns or else you would become a slave. You needed guns to capture slaves, and the cycle would continue. But the increased firepower allowed African states to expand over their neighbors, producing more slaves, which they would trade for more European guns. As a result, there was unending warfare and disruption of societies through the slave trade. Now, the College Board really wants you to remember that the Europeans didn't invent this. They just intensified African enslavement that had already existed for generations. And they took it to another level, right? They just really scaled up the violence and the overall horribleness that people were already doing to each other. The effects on social structures were that very few men in many communities were left in their original communities, because men were the most desirable as slaves just to farm and survive in the relatively harsh climate of the quote-unquote New World. Families and communities actually became more matriarchal than before. The Portuguese established outposts, aka factories, at Elmina, Luanda, Mozambique Island, Kilwa, and Mombasa. They were searching for gold, spices, and pepper. They had to work with the consent of the local African rulers, and they were impressed with the organization of the African kingdoms of Congo, Benin, Mali, Songhai, and so on. They carried out missionary efforts, trying to convert African kingdoms, and then Nzinga of Congo made the region Christian with Portuguese support. And that's someone that you can kind of remember as how the Africans responded to Portuguese expansion, how they responded to the taking of slaves. Africa is not a monolith at the end of the day. That's really something you should take away from this. Now, China actually renounced pursuing international trade in 1433 altogether, and most European trade after that occurred through Macau, which was a Portuguese colony. The Europeans were frustrated that the Chinese were clinging to tradition and trying to avoid European developments. The Europeans sent American silver to China to try to pay for the goods, and then Japan started turning to isolationism from the 16th century. They were seeing that these Europeans were being a little bit aggressive, and they were kind of scared by that. And all they really wanted was Western gunnery, because Japan already was dreaming of empire. It was dreaming of expanding its own brand of violence to the rest of the world. And ultimately, this threatened samurai dominance and aggravated feudal wars, because they had a lot of guns, these nice European guns going on, and Japan had always been a very militaristic culture, and so when the guns started entering Japan, the immediate influence we already saw was a lot of civil unrest. And then when it comes to India's Mughal Empire, the Mughal encouraged small port enclaves, and they would sell textiles and spices for New World silver, but ultimately world trade was not a major interest for these Indians, and it was not the same for Ottomans, and it was not really in the interest of the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Russians either. They were all kind of insular or focused on their own domestic internal affairs. Pictured here are the Catholic martyrs that were persecuted by the Japanese during this time due to the policies of Sakoku. The College Board wants you to remember, in these illustrative examples, that there were Indian Ocean Asian merchants still actively trading. It wasn't just the Europeans expanding and conquering. There were Swahili Arabs, the Omanis, the Gujaratis, and the Javanese. They weren't going anywhere. They were in the Indian Ocean. They were actively Asian merchants there, and the Europeans just tapped into those pre-existing networks. That's something you definitely want to remember. In terms of governance, mercantilist policies and practices were used by European rulers to expand and control their economies and claim overseas territories. Joint stock companies influenced by these mercantilist principles were used by rulers and merchants to finance exploration, and they were used by rulers to compete against one another in global trade. Economic disputes led to rivalries and conflict between states. In terms of economic systems, the Atlantic trading system involved the movement of goods, wealth, and labor, including enslaved people. The new global circulation of goods was facilitated by chartered European monopoly companies and the global flow of silver, especially from Spanish colonies in the Americas, which was used to purchase Asian goods for the Atlantic markets and satisfy Chinese demand for silver. Regional markets continued to flourish in Afro-Eurasia by using established commercial practices and new transoceanic and regional shipping services developed by European merchants. Peasant and artisan labor continued and intensified in many regions as the demand for food and consumer goods increased. These are maps of how the world was changing at this time. Above, you see that the blue are British, the yellow are French, the green are Portuguese, the Spanish are pink, and the brown are Dutch. Below, the map below that is the map of the Spanish claims and the Portuguese claims circa 1550. Now remember that in 1493, the Pope's line of demarcation was drawn so that Spain could claim dominion over its portions of the new land. But then in 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas, Brazil was awarded to Portugal. So you don't have to remember the exact dates, but just remember like the rough time period, and just be able to recognize it when you see it. Okay, so you have to understand mercantilism, though. The three G's, this rallying cry of God, gold, and glory. So you're going to go conquer and enslave these people, this quote-unquote new world, and you're going to do it for God, you're going to do it for gold, you're going to do it for glory. Now, that was the general idea, but the actual mercantilist idea was fundamentally a system of planned economic extortion and exploitation that was carried out by the state. When we look at mercantilism, it has three key tenets. What are the three key tenets? First, the prosperity of a nation is dependent upon its capital, aka you have to have gold and silver on hand. Remember, Europe was just emerging from a gold famine, right? Because it had just been squandering all of its gold and its riches on importing that cinnamon and spice and everything nice. A second key tenet of mercantilism was that government should export more than it imports, right? And so what happens? You mine gold and silver in the New World, and then you ship the gold and silver to the mother country, and then you hold the gold and the silver in the treasury, and then you import less than you export. The third and final key tenet of mercantilism was that you would utilize colonies to import raw materials from, and then you would manufacture those into goods, and you would sell them back to the colonies. So from the mother country, your manufactured goods made from raw materials would go to the colonies in the form of clothing, furniture, alcohol, art, jewelry, and so on. And then the raw materials you would import from the colonies in the form of gold, silver, cash crops, fur, and wood. It was rigged in such a way that you could not possibly lose if you were the mother country. When we look at social interactions and organization at this time, some notable gender and family restructuring occurred, including demographic changes in Africa that resulted from the trade of enslaved people. The Atlantic trading system involved the movement of labor, including enslaved people, and the mixing of African American and European cultures and people, with all parties contributing to this cultural synthesis. The cultural development and interactions were that in some cases the increase in intensification of interactions between newly connected hemispheres expanded the reach and furthered development of existing religions and contributed to religious conflicts and the development of syncretic belief systems and practices. In illustrative examples, we see a lot of competition over the trade routes, Muslim-European rivalry in the Indian Ocean, as well as Moroccan conflict with the Songhai Empire. There was increased peasant and artisan labor from Western Europe in the production of wool and linen, in India, cotton, and China, silk. Now let's look at internal and external challenges to state power that occurred in this time period from between 1450 to 1750. We have to remember Queen Ana Nzinga's resistance, right? She was the 17th century queen of the Ndongo and the Matamba kingdoms. She fought for the freedom of her kingdoms against the Portuguese. The Portuguese were colonizing the African coast, trying to facilitate the slave trade. She converted to Catholicism in 1622, likely to strengthen a peace treaty with the Portuguese and prevent a political takeover of her kingdoms. But in 1657, exhausted by war, Nzinga eventually signed a peace treaty with Portugal. Despite her efforts, eventually by 1671, Ndongo became part of Portuguese Angola. State expansion and centralization led to resistance from a lot of social, political, and economic groups on local levels. Enslaved people challenged existing authorities in the Americas through organized resistance. Illustrative examples include local resistance, Pueblo revolts, the Fronde, the Cossack revolts, the Maratha conflict with the Mughals, and Ana Nzinga King Philip's War. And for the resistance of enslaved people, we have to look at the establishment of maroon societies in the Caribbean and Brazil, as well as the resistance of enslaved people in North America. Let's look at some examples of resistance and rebellions. In North America, you did have slave resistance. They ranged from small acts of resistance, such as sabotaging production, breaking machinery, stealing produce, to escaping and fleeing for the northern states, where slavery was not legal. Remember the Underground Railroad? Rebellions were infrequent, but they did exist. Remember the Palmares? It lasted from 1605 to 1694. This was a runaway slave kingdom in Brazil that resisted Portuguese and Dutch attempts to destroy it for 100 years. And Suriname was a plantation colony where large numbers of slaves ran off in the 18th century and waged war against their captors. Maroon societies were communities of fugitive slaves who established societies of their own in hiding. Now let's look at the Amerindian revolts. There was a late but rapid population growth of Native Americans in the New World, 13 million by 1800. With the declining mortality rates and the increasing fertility levels, as well as the increasing immigration from Europe, there were a lot of new areas for development. In the Puebloan Revolt of 1680, the uprising of Pueblos took place against Spanish colonizers in present-day New Mexico. The primary cause was the Spanish attempting to destroy the Puebloan religion and ban dances and Kachina dolls. The Puebloan victory drove out the remaining Spanish. Between 1780 and 1783, Tupac Amaru led the Peruvian revolt against abuses of the Spanish regime. 70,000 Indians, mestizos, and Creoles joined, but the Creoles feared real social upheaval might change their status, and they ended their support eventually. In 1781, when we look at the Comunero Revolt, This was a revolt in New Granada over the government's control of tobacco and liquor, rising prices, and high taxes. The Spanish army was defeated and the viceroy fled. The government concessions ended the rebellion eventually. Now let's look at La Fronde and the Cossack revolts. La Fronde was a series of civil wars in France between 1648 and 1653. If you feel like this is giving you deja vu, it probably should be, it probably is, because it is a node in the spiral. This was what inspired King Louis XIV to become the sun god, declare himself the state itself, right? This it's solidified the monarchy, the absolute monarchism of Louis XIV's reign. But at this time, what was the Fronde? It was a series of civil wars in France, right? And it failed, preparing the way for the absolutism of Louis XIV's reign, right? And the Fronde essentially was part of an attempt to check the growing power of royal government. And so these expressions of discontent against the monarchical absolutism of that time period, against the centralization of the monarch's power, they were checked and tamped, and on those ashes, the absolutism of the absolute monarchy of Louis XIV was created, only to be toppled not long after by the French Revolution. So that's that sense of continuity that you have to keep in mind as we go on to the next units. Now let's look at the Cossack revolts, the Cossack uprisings. There were a series of military conflicts between the Cossacks and the states claiming dominion over the territories where the Cossacks lived. Cossack is the Slavic word for free man. So these people don't like being lorded over. They're their own people and they just live freely. But then, namely, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Russian Empire, they were all sort of vying for dominion over those areas where the Cossacks traditionally lived during the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. Both states tried to exert control over the independent Cossacks, and while the early uprisings were against the Commonwealth, the Russian Empire gained increasing and then total control over the Ruthenian, also called the Ukrainian lands, where the Cossacks lived, and the Cossacks would keep uprising, but they would be revolting against different overlords every time, or people that were professing to be the overlords of the very free Cossacks. So the Cossacks didn't take kindly to that. Let's go look at the Mughal-Maratha Wars between 1680 and 1707, and remember, and the war started in 1680 with the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb's invasion of the Maratha enclave in Bijapur, and despite the Mughal army's vast numerical superiority, the empire's treasury, the support of allies like the Portuguese, the Golconda, and the Bijapur sultanates, the war ended in 1707 with a Maratha victory. This weakened the Mughals, and by the time he died in 1707, Aurangzeb had conquered most of India but drained the treasury. And so in this, what do we see? We see that Britain and France ended up growing interested in India as a colony, and central government declined. India returned to its local government by 18th century. In the Mughal-Maratha Wars, in La Fronde, in the Cossack revolts, what do we see? We see challenges to a centralizing state power, challenges to a centralizing monarchy. Sometimes the monarchy suppresses, sometimes the uprising succeeds, sometimes the monarchy, or sometimes the absolute power, tries to crush external seemingly weaker powers, only to end up spelling its own doom. In the illustrative examples, you need to remember differential treatment of groups in society, politics, and the economy, such as the expulsion of Jews from Spain and Portugal, the acceptance of Jews in the Ottoman Empire, restrictive policies against the Han Chinese in Qing China, and the varying statuses of different classes of women within the Ottoman Empire. Existing elites, Ottoman Timars, the Russian boyars, and then the European nobility. In terms of the social interactions and organization, many states like the Mughal and Ottoman empires adopted practices to accommodate the ethnic and religious diversity of their subjects, or to utilize the economic, political, and military contributions of different ethnic or religious groups. In other cases, states suppressed diversity or limited certain groups' roles in society, politics, or the economy. Imperial conquests and widening global economic opportunities contributed to the formation of new political and economic elites, including in China with the transition to the Qing dynasty, and in the Americas with the rise of the casta system. And now for the total review of Unit 4's key concepts. The interconnection of the eastern and western hemispheres, which was made possible by transoceanic voyaging, transformed trade and had a significant social impact on the world. You had knowledge and scientific learning and technology from the classical Islamic and Asian worlds that spread and facilitated European technological developments and innovation. The developments included the production of new tools, innovations in ship designs, and an improved understanding of regional wind and currents patterns. All of this made transoceanic travel and trade possible. Although the world's productive systems continue to be very heavily centered on agriculture, you did have some major changes occurring in agricultural labor, the systems and locations of manufacturing, gender and social structures, and environmental processes. The demand for labor intensified as a result of the growing global demand for raw materials and finished products. You had traditional peasant agriculture increasing and changing in nature, plantations being expanded, and the Atlantic slave trade being developed and intensified. Empires achieved increased scope and influence around the world, shaping and being shaped by the diverse populations they incorporated, as economic disputes led to rivalries and conflict between states. Phew, well, that was a trip through time, and my voice is starting to disappear. But I hope that was helpful, and stay tuned for part 2. Starting with revolutions in Unit 5. And that'll expand all the way up to the present day. You'll want to subscribe and like and keep your eyes peeled for that one. I wish you best of luck on your exams, and I'll see you very, very soon. Tschüss.